This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
Imagine a sprawling Celtic landscape, windswept moors, emerald forests, and the echo of ancient rivers like the Danube. Here lies the heart of Europe's first wild warriors, a tapestry woven with the names of heroes and clans, from the Senones to the Bituriges. The Celts, often painted by Greeks and Romans as both noble savages and fearsome barbarians, stormed through the annals of history, their swords flashing and songs rising in defiance of time itself. Yet, were they just marauders, or something far more intricate? A culture tied to the earth and sky, to rivers and stars. Plato spoke of their passion for war and drink, painting them as brave and impetuous. But beneath the glint of their bronze shields and the deep swigs of uncut wine lay a people of art, philosophy, and trade. Across vast rivers and seaways, they connected the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, crafting networks of exchange long before the rise of Rome. Poseidonius, who walked among them, called them noble savages, admiring their valor while noting their ornate attire and ostentatious gold. Were these observations mere caricatures, or a mirror of a civilization that thrived on paradox? Traveling through their territories, from Iberian shores to the valleys of Gaul, we see a culture in flux, constantly reinventing itself. The Beaker folk brought their single burials and ornate pottery. Later, the Hallstatt and La Tène elites carved empires from amber, gold, and tin. Their warriors, raiders, and chieftains moved in chariots, wielding long swords and crafting alliances as fluid as their rivers. Yet, the Romans pushed back, turning noble tribes into conquered peoples, reshaping their myths into legends. What remains of the Celts today is more than the echoes of battle cries or the ruins of hill forts. It's a legacy buried in art, language, and story, one passed from bard to bard, inscribed in the Book of Leinster, and immortalized in the timeless Tainbo Quailing. As we journey through the Celtic past, we unearth not just a people, but a vibrant mosaic of their world, bridging the gap between myth and reality. This is their story, as alive and turbulent as the lands they once called home. According to Strabo, Ephorus thought Celtica was so vast that it encompassed most of Iberia up to Gades, Cadiz. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who wrote his history in the 5th century, is the source he followed. He claimed that the Celts inhabited what is now southern Portugal, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, bordering the Cynesians, Europe's westernmost inhabitants. Herodotus also provides other intriguing tidbits of Celtic geography. He said the Danube rose in the Celts' homeland, close to Pyrenae. If Pyrenae is referring to the Pyrenees, he is likely combining several facts he has learned about the Celts, such as the Danube's formation in Celtic lands, and the Celts' proximity to the Pyrenees. The ethnographer Hecataeus of Miletus, who lived around the end of the 6th century BC, is an earlier source. Others have cited fragments of his lost work, which establish Massalia, Marseille, as a Greek city in Ligurian territory near Celtica, and Narbonne, near present-day Narbonne in southern France, as a Celtic city and trading hub. We are still determining the location of another Celtic city, Nyrax. Some people in Austria believe it was Noricum. A lot is known. It appears that early Greek geographers had a limited understanding of European geography and were happy to classify most barbarians from the Middle Danube to the Atlantic as Celts, even though they knew some were not. However, what about Keltoi, Just as the Greeks recently used the term Eskimo to refer to the peoples of the circumpolar zone, could they have coined this term as a general term to refer to the various northern barbarians they encountered? This was clarified by Julius Caesar. 2 centuries later, the Greek Pausanias highlights that Keltoi was a far more ancient name than Galli. He writes of Gaul, France, in the middle of the 1st century BC, stating quite deliberately of the inhabitants, presumably in an attempt at clarification, we call them Gauls, though in their own language they are called Celts. Other authors use the terms Galli, Galatai, and Keltoi, Celte interchangeably. Where does this leave us then? The most straightforward explanation is that certain peoples who identified as Celts, at least as early as the 6th century BC, lived in central Gaul, roughly between the Gironde and the Seine, during Caesar's reign. Others are more likely to use the general-purpose term Galli, Galatae, which can mean enemy or stranger, to describe the northern barbarians, including the Celts. It remains uncertain whether all Galli, Galatae considered themselves Celts. Although the usage of the classical writers may seem careless at first, it may reflect a dynamic situation in temperate Europe where different tribes formed alliances and confederations and took on the names of the dominant ones. It is probable that small groups from various tribes merged into larger movements and then broke up again with some rapidity during the 4th century BC, when there seems to have been increased mobility, including significant folk movements. See Chapter 5. This led to a state of ethnic confusion among classical historians, a situation they likely experienced themselves. Therefore, it's possible that some classical authors used the terms Celts and Gauls to refer to different ethnic groups. In general, the authors likely use the terms more loosely, similar to how we might use Greek, Roman, or even American today. The Mediterranean world had ample opportunities to closely observe the Celts of temperate Europe until the start of the 4th century BC. They first appeared in the Mediterranean as mercenaries, migrants, and raiders. Some even crossed the Alpine passes to settle in the Po Valley and attack Italy. Others, on the other hand, traveled from the Middle Danube to Asia Minor, Greece, and the Balkans. Later, as the imperial armies advanced into Iberia, across Gaul and into the upper and middle Danube valleys, the Romans confronted the Celts, who were native peoples in their territories, for conquest and rule. These mostly violent encounters gave the Mediterranean world a close-up look at Celts, frequently present in large numbers. These experiences also required the development of a philosophical framework to introduce and understand these formidable northerners. Being barbarians, the Celts were clearly other, different from us, and deserved a straightforward description. It was important to emphasize their savage or non-Mediterranean characteristics and actions. The Celtic stereotype became a caricature, and like all caricatures, it was selective, exaggerated, and generalized, but it had a foundation in reality. In his Laws, written in the middle of the 4th century, Plato first mentioned Celts. He emphasizes their propensity for war and intoxication. He might have been a first-hand observer of the mercenaries that Dionysius of Syracuse used in battles on the Greek mainland. Although mercenaries may not always accurately reflect their culture, Plato's observations often revealed these two aspects of Celtic behavior. For instance, Strabo is very clear. The entire race is quick to fight, high-spirited and war-mad, but they are all honest and not wicked people. When agitated, they readily and freely gather in their bands for combat. They are prepared to put themselves in danger using only their bravery and strength. This and much of Strabo's other information on Celtic behavior likely came from Posidonius's lost ethnographic works. Since Posidonius is believed to have traveled to the west, most likely in Gaul, in the late 2nd century BC, it's possible that he made first-hand observations in addition to copying information from earlier sources. Posidonius served as the basis for Diodorus Siculus' description of Celtic wine consumption. The vast amount of wine amphorae discovered on Gaulish sites attests that the Gauls imported Roman wine in large quantities back then. He writes of the Celts in Gaul, "They are exceedingly fond of wine and sate themselves with unmixed wine imported by merchants. Their desire makes them drink it greedily, and when they become drunk, they fall into a stupor or into a maniacal disposition." Undoubtedly, Diodorus is indirectly reporting an actual observation, but he emphasized the difference between the barbarian Celts and the civilized Mediterraneans, who favored diluting their wines, by pointing out that the Celts drank undiluted wine. Though they drank our wine, the Celts were considered others. Every Roman student would have learned two things about the Celts: their valor in battle and their intoxication. But it's crucial to recognize the difference between Roman and Celtic bravery. Therefore, Strabo asserts that while Celtic bravery is open and spirited, it is also characterized by childish boastfulness, evident in their extravagant use of gold and ostentatious attire. He purposefully uses these statements to draw attention to the differences between the Celt and Roman cultures, regardless of how true they may be. It is this vanity that makes them unbearable in victory and so completely downcast in defeat. Despite their bravery, the Celts are frequently conceited and ebullient, which can quickly demoralize others. The Romans are also brave but sober, disciplined and unwavering. Anecdotes portraying the Celt as other abound in the classical texts. For example, Aristotle states that the Celts openly support homosexuality, explains that they toughen their children by submerging them in cold rivers and clothing them sparingly, and subtly observes that the Celts take up arms against the sea. According to Ephorus, whom Strabo quotes, the Celts are careful not to put on weight or get a pot-belly, and they punish a young man if his stomach bulges over his belt. Diodorus's depiction of the Celts' long, drooping mustaches, so long that they completely cover the mouth, forcing drinks through them, provides another example that would undoubtedly have made a Roman schoolboy laugh. We cannot ascertain how common these behavior patterns are, even if we observe these vignettes accurately. Born on the Orontes River in Apamea, Posidonius was a Syrian-Greek polymath. After completing his studies in Athens, he moved to Rhodes and established a school of Stoic philosophy that became well known throughout the Mediterranean. Cicero and Pompey were two of the many students who attended. He wrote on a variety of topics in addition to philosophy, such as geography, astronomy, mathematics, zoology, botany, anthropology, and history. He embarked on a voyage to explore the central and western Mediterranean around 90 BC. Naturally, Italy and Rome were on his itinerary. But he also spent much time in southern Gaul and Spain, where he first encountered the Celts. His vast travels provided the material for his important work, Histories, which sought to chart the development of the Roman world between 146 BC and the middle of the 1980s. Despite extensive research in 52 books, only quotations from the works of later authors contain this information. Posidonius's ethnography of the Celts contained information about Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Athenaeus, and possibly Caesar. People labeled the Stoic philosopher Posidonius a soft primitivist for depicting the Celts as noble savages. Depending on his writing goals, each writer would have added additional biases, even though most classical writers who described Celts would have unintentionally adhered to the stereotype of the Celt as the other. Aristotle, Plato, and Ephorus initially emphasized the distinctions between Greeks and barbarians, but later refined this stereotype as the Greek and Roman worlds confronted the Celts directly during the migrations and their aftermath in the 4th and 3rd centuries. The leitmotif now focused on how the northern warriors, wild and fearless, refined their greatness and challenged the Mediterranean. It proved the victory of their respective worlds and ideals, civilization over savagery, order over chaos, to authors like Polybius, Livy, and Pausanias. To portray a Greek or Roman victory as a significant victory, it was necessary to highlight and possibly distort the Celts' otherness, while simultaneously demonstrating their strength as a noble and deserving adversary. Once established, the Romans constantly reminded themselves of the danger emanating from the north. Others also used their triumphs over the Celts to represent their superiority. Pergamum, a strong Hellenistic city-state in western Asia Minor, accomplished this with a certain skill. Following an attack on Delphi in 279 BC, a sizable Celtic population migrated into Asia Minor and eventually established themselves in the middle of what is now Ankara. Only Pergamum was strong enough to withstand the raiding parties that terrorized the surrounding areas. From here, especially the Greek cities along the Aegean coast. Following early victories in the 220s, Attalus the king, erected a sizable victory monument in the Pergamum sanctuary of Athena that showed the Gauls defeated. This group first created the well-known statue of the dying Gaul, usually thought to be a later Roman replica. Another statue showed Gaul committing suicide while holding his wife's body. This was a truly honorable adversary, and the Pergamon kings later made more extravagant claims between 168 and 166 BC, following the Gauls' final defeat. A sculptured frieze depicting victory decorated a great altar in the Temple of Zeus at Pergamum. An equally monumental portrayal of the Attalid rulers defeating the Gauls balanced the vigorous scene of Zeus and Athena defeating the giants. Everyone could see the symbolism. Athens built a victory monument on the Acropolis to reach a larger audience. This time, the reliefs showed the Greek victory over the Persians at Marathon in contrast to the Pergamene victory over the Gauls. In mythology, the reliefs depicted the Greeks defeating the Amazons, implying that the Pergamenes' ancestors had also defeated the Titans. It would have been hard to overlook the Attalid, the Greeks' natural heirs, since they claimed to be the ones who saved Hellenism from the forces of chaos. A Celtic chieftain who led a summer raiding party to the Aegean coast is unlikely to have recognized himself as such a high-ranking adversary of civilization. The Greco-Roman world no longer faced a significant threat from the Celts after they routed the Anatolian Gauls in the 160s. 20 years before, Rome had established new Latin colonies in the Po Valley after defeating the Celts there. Finally relieved, Rome began to rewrite the myth of the Celts with the protection of the Alps. Posidonius was the most prominent revisionist. He was a Stoic philosopher from the Syrian town of Apamea and lived from c. 135 c. 50 BC. His great work, now lost except for quotations from others, continued the story of Rome from the mid-2nd century, marking the end of Polybius's history. He addressed the Roman conquest and annexation of Gallia Transalpina, roughly modern Provence and Languedoc, in the latter decades of the 2nd century. Here, Rome had made direct contact with Celtic tribes, and Posidonius wrote an ethnographic account of the locals in one of his books that was at least partially based on his own travels. The later commentator Athenaeus claims that Posidonius organized his story by his philosophic conviction. In other words, Stoic beliefs skewed the perception of the Celts, depicting them as cunning, noble savages. Only priests, the Druids, ruled over them. Despite their propensity for excessive drinking, occasional rowdiness, and odd habits like collecting human heads, they were not evil people. Posidonius believed these people were much more like the Golden Age in their simplicity than his highly developed society. Consequently, the perception of the Celts shifted from ferocious foes from beyond to neighbors eager to form political alliances and, crucially, as business partners. Many Italian merchants, with their usual lust for profit, look to the Gallic love of wine as their treasure trove, Diodorus Siculus writes, presumably paraphrasing Posidonius. They transport the wine by wagon across the plains and by boat on the navigable rivers, and they receive an absurdly high price in return. One amphora of wine is worth an enslaved person or servant in exchange for a drink. During the middle of the 1st century, BC, 59 to 51 BC, when he was waging his Gallic wars to push the empire's frontier north to the Rhine, Julius Caesar portrays the Celts he met as allies and enemies with a startling lack of emotion. There is a high level of organization and social and political sophistication among the tribes that are closest to the Roman territory of Transalpina. Although the tribes followed their own political agendas, they would band together for defense and support when needed, and charismatic leaders would emerge to guide them. Caesar's portrayal of the Celts of Gaul in the 1st century probably reflects reality, but he subtly manipulated his enemies to reflect his glory. We witness a rapidly evolving barbarian society through his eyes. Rome was well on its way to becoming friends with the Celts. Beyond them lay a new adversary, the Germans, who now assumed the role of barbarians devoid of civilization. As we have seen, the classical writers considered the Celts one of the westernmost European peoples to the extent that they provided any specificity. According to Herodotus, only the Cynites on Portugal's western coast prevented them from reaching the ocean. The Gaulish Celts were also people who faced the sea. In the well-known first paragraph of his De Bello Gallico, Julius Caesar explains that the Marne and Seine divide the Celts from the Belgae, while the river Garonne divides them from the Aquitani. This region of Gaul spoke a language ancestral to the Celtic languages spoken more recently in Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Moreover, it bore a striking resemblance to the language prevalent in much of central and western Iberia during that period. All of these factors make it necessary for us to examine Western Europe's cultural evolution over the long prehistoric era with the utmost objectivity. All it takes to emphasize that Atlantic Europe is a single region is a quick look at the map of Europe, appropriately adapted to shock our cognitive geography. The ocean connects its numerous peninsulas and promontories, while the flooded valleys along its Rhea coastlines offer protected waters that extend far inland. The major rivers of France and Iberia, flowing westward into the ocean, connect large tracts of inland land to the littoral zone. The geographical definition of Atlantic Europe, the extent of the Celts' existence as described in classical texts, and the distribution of the Celtic language groups share many similarities. More research is required on this. The significance of the Atlantic seaways as a communication channel emerged during the Mesolithic period, which lasted between the 6th and 5th millennia BC. The sea was a valuable resource for the coastal communities at the time. The size of the fish hooks used and the type of fish caught indicate that the coastal communities also exploited the deeper water. This suggests that seagoing vessels were now in use, though we don't know much about them. It's possible that Mesolithic networks of exploitation were small. However, seasonal fish shoal tracking would have brought disparate communities together, allowing for the spread of beliefs and behavioral patterns along the ocean facade, as well as the sharing of technologies. The introduction of crop cultivation and animal husbandry to the area in the 4th millennium made it easier to see the evidence of the networks of exchange that linked communities. The distribution of polished stone axes made of diorite from Plusulien in central Brittany is one of the more striking examples. Extensive maritime and riverine routes, particularly along the Loire and Seine, undoubtedly facilitated the production and distribution of the axes. Our understanding of the social context of this exchange is limited, but it is likely that communities traded the axes in cycles of gift exchange, expressing themselves socially and elevating their prestige beyond their practical use. As the distribution of megalithic monuments and tombs has long demonstrated, belief systems that connected ideas of the cosmos with attitudes toward death and ancestors also spread widely along the Atlantic facade. Recent years have revealed, through more in-depth examination of these monuments and accurate radiocarbon dating, that they embody a Mediterranean-inspired Atlantic phenomenon. The primary hubs of innovation in the fourth millennium, which were scattered across the Atlantic, were Portugal's Tagus region, southern Brittany's Morbihan, Ireland's Boyne Valley, the islands of Orkney. Despite the unique features of each area, it is astounding how similar their conceptions of architecture, art, cosmology, and belief were. This magnificent demonstration of common culture suggests the quick and constant dissemination of ideas through the long-standing social networks that surrounded the communities that faced the ocean, as well as the inland filtering of these practices along river routes. Even though we no longer need to believe in the proselytizing of megalithic missionaries along the Atlantic shores. This pattern continued in the third millennium with the emergence, spread, and adoption of a specific set of cultural characteristics, commonly known as the beaker package. This set included the deceased's single burial, a beaker-shaped pot, and various other artifacts, including arrows, wrist guards, daggers made of copper alloy, and personal ornaments like gold earrings. The beaker folk migration is believed to have long dispersed this package throughout much of Central and Western Europe. The majority of archaeologists now think that what we are seeing are regional expressions of a belief system that spread quickly via the networks of exchange established over the previous 3 millennia. Maritime Bell. The Tagus and Morbihan regions contain significant numbers of the oldest beakers. This reflects the distribution of the pioneering centers that appeared over 1,000 years earlier. The type, always connected by coastal exchange networks, may have originated in one or both regions. The exploitation of raw materials, especially gold, copper, tin, amber, and ornamental stones like jadeite, increased during the 3rd and 2nd millennia. Owing to their scarcity, people highly valued these goods and likely exchanged them within elite networks. Some places and routes received more prominence than others due to their irregular occurrence and rarity. The resources were especially plentiful in the Atlantic zone. Western Iberia's heavily mineralized pyrite zone provided gold and tin in the north and copper and silver in the south, while a region spanning from southern Ireland to North Wales was a significant source of copper, with gold originating from the Wicklow Mountains. Brittany and southwest Britain were significant sources of tin, producing both gold and copper. The 3rd millennium saw a sharp rise in demand for copper and tin due to the extensive use of copper alloys for tools and weapons. As a result, the exchange became more intense, and exploitation increased. The distribution of various artifact types along the coastal routes demonstrates how these systems function along the Atlantic. The Tagus region produces copper alloy tanged points, known as palmella points, which extend north as far as southern Brittany. Brittany, northern Britain, and northern Ireland are home to the gold Berzocana neck rings from southwest Iberia, while Cornwall, Normandy, and Brittany are home to the Irish gold lunulae, neck ornaments. These chosen instances demonstrate how vibrant the Atlantic networks are. As evidenced by the vast amounts of tools and weapons in use, many of which were buried in hoards or dumped into lakes, rivers, or bogs to satisfy some ritual requirement, the extraction and distribution of metals increased even more between the 13th century and the 7th century BC, the Late Bronze Age and the start of the Iron Age. The amount of material in the archaeological record allows for the charting and frequent quantification of the origin and distribution gradients of individual types. Before crossing the Channel into southeastern Britain, The carp's tongue sword, a unique sword type, spreads along the Loire and Seine rivers and is widely available in Brittany, where its manufacture is visible. The Charente and at least 2 locations in southern Spain produced slightly different versions of the same basic type. This implies that the Breton examples spread southward, gaining such fame that local smiths felt compelled to replicate them, albeit with minor modifications. Here, we can observe the transmission of value concepts and the exchange of artifacts. The elite warrior would have used the sword as one of his weapons to demonstrate his status. There are 8th or 7th century stone stelae in the southwest of Iberia that may have once honored fallen warriors. Many carvings depict the deceased and his equipment, such as a 4-wheeled vehicle, a sword, spear, shield, and other harder-to-identify objects like brooches and mirrors. The shields were portrayed as round with concentric raised ribs and studs, as would be expected for a shield with a beaten bronze face, while the swords occasionally bore a resemblance to the profiles of carps' tongue swords. A V-shaped break in the concentric raised ribs distinguishes the so-called V-notched shields. Despite their uniqueness, several Western European sites have documented the V-notched shields depicted by the southwest Iberian stelae. One example, made of very fine leather, was recovered from a bog in Ireland's Longford. The shield's Atlantic distribution reflects the distribution of specific sword types, such as carp's tongue swords, and unique spear varieties. This implies that the Atlantic region's warrior elites had a shared set of values that, in certain situations, even permeated the weapon's actual design. This aristocratic society is characterized by its love of feasting, a significant occasion for forming and reiterating the social hierarchy and negotiating alliances and agreements. The feast would have centered around the hearth, with spits for roasting meat, cauldrons for stewing it, and flesh hooks for raising the hot joints. In Western Europe, with a preponderance of Atlantic influences, bronze specimens of all 3 can be found in Britain and Ireland, as well as in the western regions of France and Iberia. These feasting sets, consisting of highly specialized equipment, display a distinct behavioral pattern that clearly indicates an Atlantic origin. The warrior and feasting equipment sets, which stretch from southwestern Iberia to Scotland, provide integrity to the Atlantic zone, demonstrating the widespread sharing of behavior and beliefs and the active operation of exchange networks throughout the region. Except for the end of burying bronzes in ground-based hoards, the traditional culture of the Atlantic zone appears to have been largely unaffected by the adoption of iron as the common metal for tools and weapons. On the surface, it might seem as though the bronze industry abruptly ceased, given that the majority of known bronzes in the Atlantic zone originate from hoards. However, we need to clarify a few fundamental issues. Despite the unabated demand for copper and tin, and the extensive use of bronze, the majority of Atlantic bronze either underwent recycling or local consumption until the 7th century. This allowed the metal to enter the markets of northern and west-central Europe. Since then, the Mediterranean has evolved into a discerning new market that prefers to receive its metal in the form of ingot. There's no reason to think that distribution or production went down. However, the story of hoarding's decline is a compelling one. Many contend that most hoards were votive deposits, and that the idea originated mainly for financial reasons, to take the metal out of circulation as overproduction increased. The old beliefs that demanded hoarding may have faded due to the emergence of new Mediterranean markets prepared to absorb the excess. The fundamentals of the conventional belief system persisted, regardless of the reality of these intricate problems. Until the 1st centuries AD, people still worshipped the chthonic gods, who lived in watery areas, and they offered weapons and other equipment in bogs, rivers, and springs. Though it does not necessarily imply that people used the sea for long journeys, this brief overview offers enough evidence that the sea was essential in connecting communities and distributing materials over vast distances. Viewing the Atlantic coast as a continuous corridor from Morocco to the Shetland Isles, where many people traveled but always on short-haul trips, is a better way to describe how the systems operated. In a system like that, ideas and beliefs could spread rapidly, even though people may have only traveled tens of kilometers. In terms of the main river routes, the situation remains essentially unchanged. Thanks to these corridors, the Atlantic coastal communities had direct communication with the West Central European and Iberian hinterlands and the Mediterranean world beyond. Thus far, large-scale folk movements have not been involved in this narrative. 40 years ago, the old invasionist, migrationist paradigms prevalent in the 19th and early 20th centuries would have played a significant role. Yet contemporary archaeological reasoning rarely incorporates them. This is not to argue that population movements did not occur, they obviously must have, but rather to emphasize that recent studies have tended to emphasize the continuity and persistence of indigenous populations and to explain cultural change as the result of ideas spreading throughout exchange networks spurred by localized innovation. When we look at the communities of Atlantic Europe collectively, we see that they were a cohesive cultural zone with periods of spectacular development based on indigenous innovation rather than just a far-off, dark fringe to the bright and lovely Mediterranean. How can we reconcile the Celts with this archaeological picture? The languages spoken in these areas, at least since the 6th century BC, are part of the group academics have referred to as Celtic since the early 18th century. Could it be that the indigenous Atlantic community's language evolved over the lengthy period of interaction starting in the 5th millennium BC, rather than being a language brought in by invaders or migrants arriving from Central Europe? Given this, it may be important to remember that many of the early classical writers referred to as Celts resided in Iberia and France, in the Atlantic region of mainland Europe, where their ancestors may have resided for hundreds of generations. We should wait until we have collected and analyzed more evidence before we discuss the implications of this hovering. We must consider what archaeology has to offer for West Central Europe, which roughly corresponds to southern Germany and eastern France, to finish our examination of the prehistoric past of those regions of Europe that might have a legitimate claim to be the homeland of the Celts. Geographically speaking, this area, which extends northward from the Alps' north flank, is incredibly well endowed. The Danube, Rhine, Rhône, Saône, Seine, and Loire are the principal European rivers that converge here to form a massive route node. The West Central European zone was situated where north-south routes from the West Mediterranean and Adriatic to the English Channel North Sea, and Baltic crossed the main east-west route, eventually joining the Black Sea and the Atlantic, assuming that the river valleys offered the most convenient means of communication. Communities that lived in such a place had the chance to grow strong and creative. Western Central Europe established a distinctive enough culture during the Late Bronze Age, c. the 1300, 800 BC, to set it apart from other areas of the wide continuum commonly referred to as the Urnfield culture. In this North Alpine zone, hill forts begin to emerge, and grave goods, found in many cemeteries, identify some of the numerous cremations as belonging to an elite. Artifacts such as bits and pieces of horse harnesses, depicting riding horses or the pairs of beasts used to pull the four-wheeled vehicles that may have accompanied funerary processions, provide a clue as to the status of the individual. The east of Europe, the Pontic Steppe, and other places have a long history of using horses and other four-wheeled vehicles in funeral ceremonies. One may be tempted to attribute the emergence of these characteristics in the North Alpine zone to the development of communication, which gave the elites of the area a unique behavioral model to emulate in order to set themselves apart from those of lower social standing. Because they adopted the inhumation rite, which entailed burying their grave goods alongside them rather than destroying them on the funerary pyre. The elite gained prominence in the archaeological record during the 8th and 7th centuries, also referred to as the Hallstatt sea period. Four-wheeled vehicles, likely funerary wagons, typically mark these more affluent graves, burying the dead in a large pit with additional tools like long slashing swords and horse harnesses. The Hallstatt sea wagon burials span a relatively small region from Bohemia to southern Germany, and they serve as the focal point of a broader area where warriors of lesser status interred themselves with their distinctive iron swords, albeit without the wagon's prestigious emblem. If the concentration of iron swords is considered a sign of this core cultural group, the zone encompasses the entire region from Bohemia to Burgundy and from the Alps to the Middle Rhine. Although it is difficult to model the social complexity of such a vast area based solely on archaeological evidence, the easily distinguishable various grave sets point to a hierarchical society. Long-standing networks of obligation preserved cordial ties between the various communities, and the population stayed mostly unchanged after 6 or 7 centuries of stability, inheriting ancestral territories in uninterrupted succession for generations. The numerous distinct polities that make up the Hallstatt Sea core zone now consider themselves one people. An important turning point in the Hallstatt elite's development occurred in the 6th century, which increased their archaeological recognition. The chieftains were able to attract unique manufactured goods from the Greek and Etruscan worlds northward to their courts by establishing connections with the Mediterranean. Slowly, the contacts formed. The Etruscans were the first to establish trading entrepôts on the southern coast of France around the Golfe de Lion, at locations such as Saint-Blaise at the mouth of the Rhône in the 7th century. Trade goods occasionally made their way further north, but the economic imperative was to trade with the coastal communities and the immediate hinterland. Greeks from the Asia Minor coast started exploring these waters in the late 7th century, and around 600 BC they founded their own trading post at Massalia, Marseille. The Greek enterprise started to rule the area by the middle of the 6th century. Along with locally produced Massaliot wine transported in characteristic amphorae, imported items like bronze wine-drinking vessels and Attic pottery cups, black and red-figured ware, started appearing more frequently in the archaeological record. This was the case not only in the coastal region and the lower Rhône Valley, but also more often on the Hallstatt sites in west-central Europe. Identifying the forces that attracted these luxuries to the north is a challenge. It is quite possible that the more elaborate items, such as the great bronze crater from Vix, were diplomatic gifts given to the northern chieftains' courts to foster good relations and facilitate trade. One scholar has jokingly referred to these gifts as introductory offers. The native elites viewed the ease of access to luxury goods as a new means of showcasing their exalted status in life and death. Consequently, they found Mediterranean imports in defended hilltop settlements like Mont-la-Soie and Höneberg, and in the burials of the paramount, such as those interred with wagons, and other elaborate gear at Vix, Hochdorf, and Michel. The rich Hallstatt D burials and the modern hilltop settlements, often referred to as assets of nobility, form a compact zone that stretches from Burgundy to Baden-Württemberg, spanning approximately 600 kilometers east-west and 200 kilometers north-south, and encompasses the headwaters of all major rivers. The distribution of Mediterranean imports and the extensive use and deposition of gold vividly demonstrate the society's wealth. The social system that allowed these elites to sustain themselves is what we have dubbed a prestige goods economy. The argument goes that the elites defended their exclusive access to luxury goods from outside the system, and patrons gave some valuable goods and exotics to clients at different levels of the hierarchy as gifts in return for services. Under such a system, the paramount chieftain would have obtained exotic Mediterranean goods through intermediaries who would have acted as ambassadors for the Mediterranean partners. The feast would have been a venue for the exchange of gifts of equal value, most likely consisting of raw materials like gold, amber, tin, salt, furs, and a workforce of enslaved people, all of which could have come from the zone itself, or from the peripheral areas to the north and west. As described here, the socio-economic system developed around 540 BC and ended around 480 BC, meaning that only 2 or 3 generations could maintain the equilibrium. The reasons for the system's end and the disappearance of West Hallstatt's elites from archaeological visibility are difficult to pinpoint, but a reorientation of the exchange systems with the Mediterranean world likely triggered a number of factors. One factor of direct relevance was the expansion of the Etruscan sphere of influence, extending from Etruria northwards through the Apennines into the Po Valley in the period between 520 and 480 BC, allowing the development of regular trade through the Alpine passes to the barbarian north. The rapid development of Como, a settlement on the main trading route through the mountains, and the appearance of relatively large quantities of Etruscan bronze vessels, particularly beaked flagons and stamnoi, in elite graves to the north signal this development. Etruscan towns such as Vulci likely manufactured these vessels during c. 480–420 BC. What is particularly noticeable about their distribution in West-Central Europe is that they tend to turn up in the graves of a newly emerging elite occupying a broad zone around the northern periphery of the old Hallstatt D chiefdoms. In the archaeological nomenclature, these burials belong to the La Tène A or La Tène Im period. The name change does not imply any major dislocation or movement of population. It simply reflects the cultural changes and social readjustments in the early 5th century BC. Various possible scenarios could explain the emergence of the La Tène elite. The northward expansion of Etruscan trade during this period could be the trigger. The Middle Rhineland's dense distribution of Etruscan-beaked flagons between the Rhine and Moselle suggests a deliberate connection between Etruria and this region. Such a development may have upset the delicate balance underpinning the earlier prestige goods economy upon which the Hallstatt D chiefdoms depended. Another possibility, which does not exclude the first, is that the communities commanding the major route nodes and resources around the periphery of the main concentration of Hallstatt D chiefdoms became increasingly powerful. We can recognize 4 distinct groupings of early La Tène elite burials. The largest is in the Moselle region, with another, to a lesser extent, 200 kilometers to the west in the area of the Marne. Smaller concentrations occur in Bohemia and in the vicinity of Bourges. Each dominates one of the major river routes to the west and north. The economic interaction between the resource-rich barbarian west, north, and the consuming Mediterranean provides a straightforward explanation of the Hallstatt and early La Tène elites. As the demand for commodities and labor increased in the 7th century BC, the long-standing Hallstatt elites were able to control the flow of these resources. However, after 2 or 3 generations, the communities that possessed specific resources began to gain an advantage. The Bohemian chieftains controlled the main amber route from the Baltic. The Bourges group had access to Atlantic tin.
Need a laptop that's built to perform and designed to last all day? Select Windows 11 PCs starting at $499.99 are now at Best Buy. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Want to elevate your travel experience? Here's how. With a Delta SkyMiles Reserve American Express card, you can relax before your flight in the Delta Sky Club with up to 15 visits per medallion year. And now through July 15th, 2026, you can earn up to 125,000 bonus miles, so you're closer to your next adventure. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve card. Check out the new design at www.delta.com/Spotify. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply.
The Moselle and Marne may have flourished due to various resources, including gold, iron, salt, and enslaved people. While the new early Latin chiefdoms retained some of the traits of their Hallstatt D predecessors, they also differed in a number of ways. For example, the Latin burials, when accompanied by a vehicle, favored a two-wheeled, chariot-like construction, possibly influenced by Etruscan vehicles. The Latin graves showed a notable difference in the prevalence of weapons, with swords, spears, and occasionally helmets accompanying many of the male deceased, not just the elite. In contrast, the typical weapon in the Hallstatt D chieftain burials was a dagger, which was more appropriate for hunting and feasting than for combat, though the trappings of the feast were still present in the form of Etruscan flagons, stamina, Attic cups, and occasionally roasting spits. The reason for this is not known, but one possibility is that the communities that occupied the areas surrounding the old Hallstatt core area raided to obtain enslaved people and other goods, which they then traded with the core. The growing demand for goods would have intensified these warlike tendencies, providing the means for the victorious war leader to gain power. The rich adorned their possessions with this aristocratic art from the beginning. Among the earliest pieces, one can see the various elements from which the artisans drew inspiration. Etruscan prototypes gave rise to the forms of the vessels, and the native metalworker quickly transformed formal Etruscan motifs, like the palmette and arabesque, into vigorous scrolls, tendrils, and leaf motifs that flow with such ease. The animal art of the East, possibly from the Scythian communities of the Great Hungarian Plain or beyond, also provided some inspiration. Moreover, the courts of the elites in the Marne and Moselle regions provided the patronage required for the spectacular development of craft skills, especially a highly distinctive art. While the earliest Celtic art is still formal and heavily reliant on bilateral symmetry, it soon explodes into an exuberant asymmetry. In the unemotive terms art historians use, the early strict style gives way to the style. Initially, one can clearly see the animals and their stylistic ancestry, as evidenced by the beasts adorning the gold arm ring from Rodenbach. In contrast to the fact that art styles are deeply ingrained in society and reflect its beliefs and values, archaeologists have occasionally treated Celtic art as a distinct subject to be studied in isolation, divorced from all social contexts. Therefore, adopting an art style is more than just a random borrowing of decorative motifs. Rather, it is embracing a culture in all its complexity. Putting aside isolated items scattered through exchange networks, one could argue that communities adopt the values reflected in the Celtic art style by incorporating them into their own material culture, thus announcing their acceptance of a shared set of cultural values. Whether we can interpret this as a claim to a shared ethnic identity is a topic we will return to. Individuals in motion. Greek and Roman historians, writing several centuries after the events, well documented the movement of Celts from the north of the Alps into the Mediterranean lands from around 400 BC. They provided enough detail to describe the history of the various migrations and raids, giving us some insight into the communities involved and the fighting techniques of the warriors. That being said, it is important to remember that our two main sources, Polybius, c. 204 till 122 BC, and Livy, 59 BC AD 17, wrote with specific pro-Roman goals in mind, readily adopting and even embellishing the established Celtic stereotype. Overpopulation sparked the migrations, according to Livy, who also notes that the Bituriges led the exodus in Gaul. Ambigatus, the king, selected two nephews to lead the exodus, and after consulting the augurs, one led his people eastward through Bohemia and the Black Forest, while the other moved south into Italy. Taking with him the surplus populations, Bituriges, Arverni, Senones, Aedui, Ambari, Carnutes, Aulersi. He set out with a vast host, some mounted, some on foot. Histrost 534. After crossing the Alps, they established a settlement at Mediolanum, now known as Milan. Pompeius Trogus, a later writer, adds that some of the 300,000 Gauls involved in the migration moved on, past the head of the Adriatic, to settle in Pannonia, modern Hungary. The Gauls arrived around 600 BC, according to Livy, but Polybius places their arrival 200 years later. We can explain this seeming contradiction by arguing that the first movements may have begun around 600 BC, when small groups infiltrated the Alpine passes and settled in the southern foothills of the Alps near Lake Como and Lake Maggiore. The Golaseca culture, as it is known from archaeology, inhabited this area, trading goods with the Hallstatt communities to the north. A southward population drift is not implausible. In fact, there is some archaeological evidence that suggests Celtic settlement in the 5th century on the southern edge of the Golasecan sphere, where the Etruscans purposefully placed the Celts as a check on their expansionist intentions. This initial wave of Celts turned into a surge at the end of the 5th century. Archaeological evidence, which names specific tribes and sometimes connects them to their homelands north of the Alps through burial rituals, supports Polybius's account of the main migrations. He names the tribes and talks about how they slowly settled in the Po Valley, going through already claimed land to get there, and the Senones who moved far south to take up the last bit of land between the Apennines and the Adriatic. Polybius said the Celtic settlers lived in villages and pursued war and agriculture. The Celtic settlers measured wealth in cattle and gold and determined a man's status by the size of the entourage he could persuade to serve under his patronage. In general, the bald story outline of the classical writers is consistent with the rather softly focused archaeological evidence, but it oversimplifies a complex reality. These archaeologically visible items likely represent only a small portion of the luxury products from the south that were transported to the north. All sources concur that the main cause of migration was overpopulation, and the lure of the Po Valley's bounty, particularly dried figs, grapes, oil, and wine, drew people southward. The long-established exchange networks, which saw the export of Etruscan wine-drinking gear, among other commodities, to the north from the late 6th century onwards, easily explain this second point. The question of population pressure is more difficult to approach, but ample evidence in the Marne and Moselle regions suggests that the 5th century saw a consistent and quite dramatic rise in population. We have observed that the elite in these areas formed a warrior aristocracy, implying that the social system embedded warfare in the form of raiding. In a situation with a steady increase in population, it is straightforward to see how raiding expeditions may have become increasingly ambitious, with the young war leaders having to take their followers further and further from the homeland. A system of this kind has a built-in trajectory of escalation. Some leaders would not take long to permanently relocate from their homeland and establish themselves and their followers in distant territories. Once begun, the momentum would have increased, drawing populations away to colonize new ecological niches from which to raid new territories. Some such dynamics could have provided the motor for the Celtic migrations, beginning with small-scale movements in the 6th century and reaching a crescendo of colonization by the end of the 5th century. The fact that the Marne and Moselle homelands appear to have undergone some degree of depopulation in the 5th century further supports the scenario. Polybius emphasizes that the Celtic communities continued their raiding lifestyle after settling in the Po Valley, and there is abundant historical evidence of their raids to the south. Celtic bands attacked the Etruscan town of Clusium in 391 BC. A year later, they had ravaged much of the expanding city of Rome and were besieging the remaining parts, including the capital. For the next 150 years, the raids continued intermittently, with some bands even traveling as far south as Apulia. Dionysius of Syracuse recruited Celtic warriors, probably under the leadership of their own war leaders, at Ancona in the Senones territory as mercenaries for his campaigns as early as 385 BC. Over the next 30 years, he and his son used Celtic mercenaries in Italy and Greece, although the general pattern, at least initially, may have been of organized raids occurring annually during the summer season, with the warriors returning home to the Po Valley with their loot in the fall. A sizable Celtic population in the Po Valley served as a supply of fighting men, and Hannibal used Celtic mercenaries in his campaigns in Italy during the Second Punic War, 214-202 BC, with some degree of success. Rome realized it needed to deal with the Celtic threat once hostilities had ended, and Roman armies compelled the Cenomani to make peace in 197 BC. Following multiple campaigns and the establishment of colonies, they eventually gained control of the Po Valley, Cisalpine Gaul, by 183 BC. A group of Celtic emissaries from the Adriatic region paid court to Alexander the Great to negotiate a treaty of friendship and hospitality, which is how we know that by 335 BC, Celtic communities had reached the Balkans, possibly via the Po Valley, even though Livy's account of the origins of the Celtic migrations described an eastern movement, apparently along the Danube Valley. The appearance of Latin-type artifacts and the adoption of Latin burial practices attest to the fact that Celtic groups, presumably using the upper Danube Valley, moved in some numbers into the middle Danube region during the 4th century. They settled on both sides of the river in Transdanubia and the Great Hungarian Plain, both now Hungary, and extended downriver to around the confluence of the Drava and Sava in modern Serbia. Other groups moved further east into Transylvania, in the center of Romania. Although the role of local populations is unclear, the communities that emerged from the 4th century melee probably included many indigenous peoples, so despite the dominant Latin appearance of the material culture, the genetic makeup could have been significantly different. Classical writers and archaeologists often refer to the Middle Danube population as Celtic, but Celticized may be a more appropriate term for depicting emerging tribal configurations. Archaeological evidence in the Bohemian homeland suggests complex population movements, including the abandonment of some land due to outward migration, the arrival of new groups from the west, and the arrival of new groups from the west. The Macedonian state controlled a substantial part of the Balkans, forming a barrier to further Celtic expansion, as evidenced by the meeting between the Celtic emissaries and Alexander in 335 BC, during which the Celts reportedly made their famous statement that they feared only that the sky might fall on them. With the death of Alexander in 323 and the political instability that ensued, new opportunities for raiding and expansion presented themselves. Brennus led Celtic raiders into Thrace and Macedonia in 298, but faced vigorous resistance. Later, in another raid in 280, a force of Celts and Thracians succeeded in killing a Macedonian commander and paraded his head on a spear. The victory paved the way for a more audacious raid the following year, when a substantial force pushed southwards into Greece to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Pausanias claims that the wealth of the Greek states and the even greater wealth in the sanctuaries, including votive offerings and coined silver and gold, attracted them. What ensued is unclear, but Delphi appears to have been largely unscathed, and the Celtic force, disheartened by earthquakes accompanied by thunder and lightning, gave up their siege and retreated northwards. Brennus, though the name may be apocryphal, was the leader of a massive raiding force of Celts, said to number 40,000, that rampaged through the Balkans in the unsettled period following the death of Alexander the Great. In 279 BC, his force overran Macedonia and moved south into Greece, attracted by knowledge of the wealth protected in the precinct of Apollo at the sacred site of Delphi. The Greeks checked the invaders at Thermopylae. Brennus divided his force into three. sending one detachment to pillage Aetolia, thus drawing the Aetolians away from Thermopylae and allowing the Celts to break through. The Greeks used guerrilla tactics to harass the Celtic detachment in Aetolia and another under Asicorius, while Brennus reached Delphi and besieged the sanctuary. The Greek sources are reticent about what happened next, but in the end, snowstorms and falling rocks demoralized the Celts, leading to Brennus's wound during an engagement. Thessalians harassed the force as it retreated northward, leading Brennus, the defeated leader, to commit suicide. It was the remnants of his force that, with others, crossed into Asia Minor. In the 1st century A.D., St. Paul addressed their descendants as "O foolish Galatians" in an epistle, recognizing them as distinctive people. Although Alexander's death and the resulting decline in Macedonian power allowed raiding Greece, this may not have been the direct cause. After all, the Celtic tribes of the Middle Danube seem to have been inactive for several generations before the onslaught. But in the 20 years preceding the raid, the Romans had been advancing against the Senones along the Adriatic coast. They decisively defeated them in 2 battles, 295 and 283 BC. The move would have angered the Senones and other Celtic tribes in the Po Valley, who would have valued their turn approaching, and many would have decided to relocate. It is possible that the new wave of migrants could have spread eastward through Slovenia and into the Middle Danube. The raid's failure immediately shattered the short-lived Celtic confederacy. Some retreated to the Middle Danube region, others established themselves in the Thracian territory near the Black Sea, and still others continued their journey, traversing the Dardanelles and the Hellespont to venture into Asia Minor. Even in the 4th century A.D., there may have been traces of the Celtic community's distant ancestry in their language, which St. Jerome claimed reminded him of the language of the Treveri living around Trier. However, Jerome's prior knowledge of the Galatians' Celtic ancestry may have conditioned his memory. The Celtic presence in Asia Minor persisted for more than 3 centuries, from the first arrivals in 278 BC until the middle of the 1st century AD, when St. Paul wrote his epistle to the Galatians, the name by which the Celtic communities were commonly known. The Celts who poured into Anatolia in the 3rd century BC were not simply warrior bands looking for action. One account records that out of a force of 40,000, half comprised women, children, and older men no longer fit for service. Evidently, this was a folk movement that needed land to settle, and their combatant menfolk had the option to either seek employment as mercenaries in the service of the local Hellenistic rulers or engage in their traditional raids. The first homeland was a barren highland area by the river Halys in northern Turkey, from where they raided at will. The Pergamene king Attalus I soundly defeated them in about 233 BC after they resettled in the center of Anatolia, focusing on the rich cities of the Aegean coastal region. The Roman and Pergamene army defeated the Celtic warriors and the Seleucid king Antiochus III in the Battle of Magnesia in 190. As part of the terms imposed by the victor, the Galatian tribe agreed to cease raiding, but in 167 they began once more to attack Pergamene interests, and it was only decisive action by the Pergamene ruler Eumenes II that finally brought them to heel, and provided Eumenes with the excuse to build his massive victory monuments at Pergamum and at Athens. Although we have a rich body of reference material, textual and sculptural, to attest to the Celtic presence in Asia Minor, surprisingly little material culture is recognizably Latin in character. This suggests that after exhausting their personal items, they embraced local products. They were moving into a more advanced culture and technology than their own. In battle, however, it would seem that they retained their traditional weapons and practices. The monument erected in Pergamum after the Celtic defeat of 233 BC depicts arms that are distinctly Latin in character, and even as late as 190, some of the Galatian fighters were going naked into battle. As 40 years or so earlier, some of the Celts fighting in Italy chose to face the enemy. Despite the initial impression of conservatism across 3 or 4 generations, it's plausible that during this period, groups of Celts from the middle Danube Valley continued to migrate to Anatolia to join their already established relatives. Whatever the case, they seem to have retained some ancestral identity. The folk movements we have covered for 400–200 BC are those for which we have some direct textual evidence, and they naturally center on contact with the Greco-Roman world. It would be surprising if there were no other movements around the northern and western fringes of the original Latène core zone, as evidenced by similar tribal names. The Parisii live in the Seine Valley and eastern Yorkshire, while the Tectosages, a tribe that crossed into Asia Minor after 279, settled around modern Toulouse. In both cases, cultural evidence points to a direct relationship. At best, it reminds us that the situation was complicated, and our evidence is frequently incomplete. During the long period of indigenous development and the frantic chaos of the folk movement, people needed to communicate with one another. The classical writer's testimony, with some support from archaeology, adds a different dimension by sketching the complex movements of peoples from West-Central Europe southwards and eastwards as they fought their way into Mediterranean history after about 400 BC. The archaeological evidence we examined above clearly demonstrates that stable communities existed in much of Western Europe, often bound together by networks of exchange. We would have a fairly solid understanding of the origins and development of the early Celtic languages after 200 years of scholarship. Still, David Ellis Evans, one of its greatest practitioners, concludes in his essay, The Early Celts, The Evidence of Language, a recent and enthusiastic review of Celtic philology, that this scholarly activity has, by and large, not produced the results that are generally acceptable and enlightening. The author warns that the labyrinthine and frustrating nature of the subject discussed here must not be denied or disguised for all the new insights gained from careful concentration on it. Celtic language studies began in Oxford at the end of the 17th century with the research of Edward Llwyd, see also p. 116. Llwyd worked at the Ashmolean Museum, first as an assistant keeper and then as its keeper from 1691 until he died in 1709. Of his many contributions to scholarship, his greatest was in comparative linguistics. By 1695, his research had reached such a point that he could prepare a prospectus for the enormous work of synthesis he intended to publish, Archaeologia Britannica. He said he wished to compare the Welsh language with other European languages, Greek and Latin naturally, but also the neighboring languages of Irish, Cornish, and Armorican. Archaeologia was to be a multi-volume work, but only the first volume ever appeared in 1707. Its aim, he wrote, was to present a clearer notion of the first planters of the 3 kingdoms and a better understanding of our ancient names of persons and places. It was necessary to provide some linguistic tools to enable his readers to understand the original sources written in Irish and British. Thus, Volume 1, entitled Glossography, presented the grammar and vocabulary of Irish, Breton, and Cornish. These languages, together with Welsh and Gaulish, he chose to refer to as Celtic. Llwyd described in his correspondence the close resemblances between Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, as well as their differences from Irish. He later systematized these differences as the differences between P Celtic and Q Celtic. To explain this, he began to develop a historical model. He debated this model with friends after 1700 and sketched it in the Welsh Archaeologia preface. He envisioned an initial colony of Gaul invaders moving into Britain, but a second wave of them drove him out to Scotland and Ireland. In Ireland, they mixed with the native Scotti, who had previously arrived from Spain, some of whom later crossed into what would become Scotland. We must emphasize that both arguments rely on assumptions. Here we have the origins of the invasionist model, which underpins the belief, still held in some quarters, that Celtic invaders from the continent brought the Celtic languages to Britain and Ireland, and that the languages of Britain and Ireland originated from the continent and resembled those of the people referred to as Celts by classical writers. Building on Llwyd's groundbreaking work and subsequent academic discussions, Sir John Rhys, professor of Celtic at Oxford University, published the seminal work Early Britain, Celtic Britain in 1882. He formalized the invasion theory by concluding that Celtic-speaking Brythonic Celts arrived in southern Britain, driving out the earlier settlers who fled to western parts of Britain and Ireland. He then clearly stated the invasion theory, leaving archaeologists to provide the supporting cultural evidence and dates. So much for past theories. Now let us examine what the linguistic evidence tells us in the light of more recent research. The Celtic languages belong to the Indo-European family of languages and are, for convenience, divided into two groups: continental and insular. Continental Celtic, as its name implies, originated on the European mainland. Apart from Breton, which poses certain complications, discussed below, Continental Celtic needs further improvement. We primarily know it from personal and place names recorded on coins, from the works of ancient historians and inscriptions, and from a few, very few, longer inscriptions that provide the briefest hints of the language's structure. This sparse record makes it possible to distinguish three distinct groups: Gaulish, Celtiberian, and Lepontic. The Middle Danube Valley and Asia Minor have scattered Celtic place names and personal names. The migratory movements that began in the 4th century BC likely gave rise to these names. Only later contexts attest to them, providing little insight into the local language. Some places, such as Great Britain, Ireland, and Brittany, still speak the insular Celtic languages. As we have seen above, it has been conventional to divide them into two groups: Q Celtic, Goidelic, P Celtic, or Brythonic. We make the distinction based on the pronunciation, and thus the spelling, of the QU sound. In Q Celtic, it remains as the rigid Q or later K, whereas in P Celtic, it softens to P. Thus, in Irish, for is there and Welsh pedway. Despite the historical emphasis on this distinction, contemporary philologists tend to downplay it, emphasizing that it represents only one, and possibly not the most significant distinction among the various constituents of Insula Celtic. Despite this, people speak Q Celtic in Ireland, the Isle of Man and Western Scotland, and P Celtic in Britain, Wales, and Cornwall until approximately 1800. The rest of Britain also spoke it until the middle of the first millennium AD, when Germanic and Romance languages began to replace it. Gaelic and Breton are two examples that highlight the complexity of studying Insular Celtic, a living group of languages whose history can be traced through a series of earlier texts. Folk movements from Ireland brought both Scottish Gaelic and Manx Celtic languages in the 3rd or 4th century AD, but it's possible that both regions already spoke Q Celtic before the historical invasions strengthened the native tongue. Brittany presents a rather more complex problem. Historical tradition is that communities migrated from southwest Britain between the 5th and 7th centuries AD to settle in the Armorican Peninsula. For a long time, the conventional view was that these communities reintroduced P Celtic into an area where Latin had replaced the original Celtic language over the 4 centuries or so of the Roman occupation. However, recent challenges have cast doubt on these views. In the 1950s, François Falc'Hun suggested that the British migrants encountered an Armorican population who still spoke Gaulish, closely akin to Brittonic. Thus, instead of reintroducing Celtic to Armorica, the incomers strengthened the language that had survived the period of Romanization. Falc'Hun further argued that the dialect of Breton spoken by the Vanitais in the southeast of the peninsula differed from that of the rest of the country. because it was a purer form of Gaulish unmodified by the British dialect, the implication being that British immigrants did not settle in that area. Léon Fleuriot, writing in the 1980s, argued that the dialects spoken for much of Brittany resulted from a Britanization of the indigenous Gaulish, but preferred to see vanitas as Gaulish influenced by Latin. These two instances serve as helpful reminders of the linguistic complexities that can arise when even small groups of people are moving around and the challenges of attempting to sort them out even when working with a living language. Today, all that remains are the sparse inscriptions and names penned by classical writers or incorporated into recorded place names. This is a scant harvest. Certainly the last remnants of spoken Celtic, if any, would have disappeared during the subsequent migration period between the 5th and 8th centuries in the rest of Europe, outside the Armorican Peninsula, during the Roman period. Gaulish is the most well-known of the continental Celtic languages. Classical writers such as Julius Caesar and Strabo documented numerous Gaulish inscriptions in Greek or Latin script that included place names and personal names. These inscriptions typically appear as graffiti on pots or as dedicatory inscriptions. The discovery of a lead tablet in the Sacred Spring in Chamalières in 1971 created a lot of excitement because it was the longest Gaulish text at the time, consisting of 336 characters, most of which were personal names. Larzac, near Aveyron, discovered a longer text of 1,000 characters, 160 words, in 1983. It was also inscribed on lead and seemed to have been a magical text, including some references to female magicians. But the text is still unclear. In Iberia, as we have seen, early Greek writers believed that at least some of the people living in western Iberia were Celts. According to Eratosthenes, their numbers had increased by the 3rd century BC, and by the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the term Celtiberi had become widely used. Diodorus posits that the name originated from the union of two tribes after a bloody war, a claim that appears speculative. Many pieces of evidence clearly demonstrate the widespread use of a Celtic language in central and western Iberia. The Celtic area has identified several language groups, with Celtiberian and Lusitanian being the most well-defined. There is much debate regarding the significance of these various groups. Some scholars contend that Lusitanian, which extends along the Atlantic coast of the peninsula, is not a Celtic language at all, while others view it as an archaic form of Celtic. Given the database's limited scope, it is unclear whether we will ever resolve such questions satisfactorily. The third region where direct evidence of the Celtic language has been found is northern Italy, where the few inscriptions that have been discovered so far are thought to be divided into two groups. The earliest group in the Lugano region, around the Italian lakes, has been named Lepontic, and the earliest ones have been dated to the 6th century BC. Livy dates the first Celtic infiltration from the north around 600 BC, making the early group especially intriguing. As we have seen, the archaeological evidence for the region, the Goloseca culture, indicates that the communities on either side of the Alps formed close contacts in the 6th and 5th centuries. It is hardly surprising that attempts to construct a grand, historical synthesis, even at the schematic level of a simple family tree, have yet to be very successful, given the fragmentary and disparate nature of the evidence for the Celtic languages. Nevertheless, there are a few basic generalizations that most people agree are true. While Gaulish and Brittonic, the P-Celtic group, share many similarities and may have developed simultaneously due to their interaction, Goidelic, the Q-Celtic of Ireland, the Isle of Man, and Western Scotland, is more archaic than Gaulish and Brito-Iberian. A slightly more controversial idea suggests that arranging these languages based on their similarity to the developed Gallo-Brittonic language would result in a Celtic-based sequence. If these relationships are valid, there are various ways to explain them. As a basic assumption, we can accept that the Celtic languages originated in Western Europe, specifically in Central and Western Iberia, Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. Archaeological evidence reveals that a network of exchange systems bound these regions, likely starting as early as the 5th millennium BC and peaking in intensity during the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1300–800 BC, due to their long-standing interactions along the Atlantic seaways and the rivers that flow into the interior. Language convergence is likely after 4,000 years of interaction, which involved the exchange of goods, knowledge, and beliefs. The Celtic language took on its earliest form during intense contact in the Late Bronze Age, sometimes referred to as Q-Celtic. Iberia, Ireland, and the Lepontic region identified this early form as early as the 6th century, indicating its widespread use in various dialects throughout the region. Listening to the stories told by storytellers was an essential part of daily life in most societies. The stories provided moral guidelines for acceptance, educated the listener about life's perils and temptations, and offered insight into the inherited past. The gathering of loved ones around the fireplace, sharing the goal of contemplating their common ancestry, was just as significant as the event itself. In the 20th century, storytellers continued to work in isolated areas of Ireland. The folklorist One such person, 70-year-old farmer-fisherman Seán O'Connell, who lived in a 2-room cottage in the hamlet of Kilrealig, in County Cork, is described by H. Delargy in a heartwarming way. Kerry in the 1920s. Despite being technically illiterate, Seán O'Connell was one of the most well-read individuals I have ever encountered in the unwritten literature of people. His mind tucked away diverse customs, humorous anecdotes, complex hero stories, proverbs, rhymes, riddles, and other components of the rich oral tradition common in Ireland 3 centuries ago. He was a conscious literary artist. He took immense pleasure in narrating his stories. His language was lively, clear, and full of literary elements. The storyteller was undoubtedly an ancient artist, and many of his tales, handed down from generation to generation, encapsulated the customs and behaviors of a bygone era. They had to commit the entire story to memory. When writing about the Druids, Julius Caesar notes that during their training they memorize a vast number of verses, so much so that some individuals dedicate 20 years to studying the doctrine. These memory feats, uncommon in a society where most people are literate, impressed him. The Book of Leinster preserves the 12th century Irish saga Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, with a colophon that emphasizes the importance of memory accuracy. A blessing awaits those who faithfully memorize the Táin in this form without alteration. Despite this, there will have been updates and additions, parenthetical explanations, and literary flourishes added for effect. We assume that the stories will continue to maintain their integrity and form. Like an archaeological site with accumulated layers, the story will have been a multi-layered construction at any given time. The most well-known examples are the Odyssey, the Iliad, and the Homeric sagas. They were composed in the 8th century BC and represent the culmination of an intricate oral tradition that had been recited for at least 5 centuries. Kenneth Jackson, a Celtic professor at Edinburgh University, delivered the Raid Lecture at Cambridge in 1964. The Oldest Irish Tradition, A Window on the Iron Age, was his title. It sparked a heated debate when Jackson published it that same year. Jackson proposed that the fundamental framework of the Irish saga Táin Bó Cúailnge offered insight into the inner workings of earlier Celtic society and mirrored heroic society in pre-Christian Ireland circa 400 AD. Later research has called into question the specifics of the argument. Jim Mallory asserts that the Táin primarily references material culture from the 6th to 9th centuries AD, not the Iron Age. Some have even gone so far as to dispute that the stories found in medieval manuscripts had anything in common with the earlier oral tradition, if it ever existed. Even after accounting for all reservations, Posidonius, 135–50 BC, found some useful connections between the Tyne and Celtic Gaul. The four categories of Irish vernacular literature found in medieval manuscripts are the historical cycle, the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, and the mythological cycle. Here, we are focusing on the Ulster cycle. Tyne is the longest of its 80 stories. The remaining stories are either standalone narratives that elaborate on the actions of some of the main characters, or they serve as scene setters, setting the scene for the main saga. 10 manuscripts, some overlapping and with different dates, contain the entire corpus. 2 manuscripts, the Book of the Dun Cow from the 11th century and the Yellow Book of Lecan from approximately 3 centuries later, contain the earliest version of the main story, Recension Y. Texts from 2 centuries before the 9th century, which are now extinct, served as the basis for Resolution 1. The Book of Leinster, which dates to the late 12th century, contains a second, more comprehensive version of the story, Recension 2. Christian scribes eventually recorded the saga, possibly as early as the 7th century after an unspecified amount of telling and retelling. They then repeatedly transcribed it in scriptoria throughout Ireland. Undoubtedly, this process led to changes such as the modernization of material culture and the removal or dilution of elements deemed offensive to Christian sensibilities. At this point, learned monks might have introduced references and imagery from the Homeric sagas. After about 500 years of literal transmission, they faithfully transmitted the text, despite its significant differences from the first transcribed oral saga. The monastic scribe who penned the Taine's text in the Book of Leinster adds a telling footnote. However, as the author of this history or tale, I don't believe in many of its claims. Some of the claims made in this history or story are the devil's delusions, while others are poetic fabrications, some of which are true, some of which are false, and some of which are merely for the author's amusement. King Ailill and Queen Medb discuss the financial contributions of their marriage in bed in the Cruachan fort at the start of the Tyne story, which is known as pillow talk. They make like-for-like comparisons until Ailill brings up Finnbanach the White-Horned, his outstanding bull. After failing to match Ailill's bull, Finnbanach the White-Horned, Medb's spirits plummet as if she has run out of money. In the province of Ulster, she finds a match, the brown bull of Cooley, and sets out to capture the beast because she is determined not to lose. The huge cattle raid then starts. The following story describes the battle between the Ulstermen, led by King Conchobhar, from the royal centre of Emain Macha, and the raiding party from Connaught and other parts of Ireland, led by Medb. The finest members of each side's warrior aristocracy compete. We meet seasoned fighters like Fergus MacRoich and Conall Cernach, as well as bold young men like the main character Cú Chulainn, the astute Sencha Mac Ailela, and Bricriu, the poison-tongued, who incites rivalries and tensions for his own gain. Another important player is the druid Cathpad. As the saga comes to a close, Ferdia is killed by Cú Chulainn in a single battle. The engagement has a special poignancy, because Ferdia turns out to be his foster brother. However, Cú Chulainn passes away from his wounds shortly after. The competition repeats itself in the final scene. After killing Finnbanach the White-Horned, Connaught welcomes the victorious brown bull of Cooley, who later succumbs to exhaustion from the fierce battle. Ulster and Connaught reached an agreement to coexist, leading to a period of 7 years without any deaths in Ireland. A recurring figure in the Ulster cycle stories is Cú Chulainn. The stories primarily focus on the Ulaid, who ruled Ulster, the northern region of Ireland at the time, which stretched from Donegal in the west to Antrim, Down, and Louth in the east. King Conchobar ruled from the capital at Emain Macha. Cú Chulainn, a hero of Ulster's men, was born to Swaltam. Some texts depict him as a semi-divine figure under the protection of the god Lug, believed to be his father. The perfect example of a hero is Cu Chulainn, who is attractive, courageous, selfless, and has a strong sense of honor. He is humorous and patient, but he can be terrible when roused. The traits of a Celtic hero in the Poseidonian tradition include fighting from chariots, chopping off enemies' heads, and having a strong interest in single combat. His most well-known role in the Tyne Bo Cuailnge was defending Ulster during the epic battle against the Connachtmen, led by the powerful Queen Medb. The Ulstermen are currently under a spell that has depleted all of their energy. The only ones who are not affected are Cu Chulainn and his father, and Cu Chulainn nearly defeats the enemy advance by himself. Existing vernacular literature expands and rewrites the character. It is impossible to determine whether a real historical figure is hiding here or if he is merely an eponymous hero. As might be expected, some Ulster factions now hold Cu Chulainn in a cult-like status. One can read a work this intricate and well-woven on many levels. Is it an allegory that enhances the listener's comprehension of the deities conceived as opposites in balance, male, female, earth, sky, and so on, and the mayhem unleashed when the balance is upset? Or is it, as some have suggested, a reflection of a long-forgotten bull cult? There is only one possible response. The action takes place in a complex and painstakingly constructed social setting. The young lord warrior aristocracy upholds strict behavioral norms. In combat, honor and skill are crucial. People take offense easily and jealously protect their own reputation. The hero's portion custom, which involves publicly offering and occasionally arguing over cuts of meat that symbolize a person's position in the hierarchy, reinforces status and serves as a unifying institution. The main character in warfare is the individual lord, who frequently fights alone. People frequently see large chariots and gather the severed heads of their adversaries as rewards. People meticulously craft social connections. Women can hold positions of power and lead wars because the elites share the dowries and raise their children together. This ensures a certain level of harmony in a society where tempers can be short. The Ulster cycle story's underlying social structure is strikingly similar to the Gaulish society that Posidonius wrote about at the start of the 1st century BC, and, to a lesser degree, Caesar wrote about 50 years later. Their extensive correspondence makes it difficult to deny that both stemmed from the same tradition. The hero's portion is widely considered the most striking. The Posidonius tradition describes the hero's portion as follows: the bravest hero used to take the thigh piece when the hindquarters were served up, and if another man did, they would get up and fight until they died. The group presented others with gold, silver, or a specific quantity of wine jars. As they distributed the gifts to friends and family, made pledges, and laid face up on their shields, someone watched and slashed their throats with his sword. In this somewhat shortened narrative, Posidonius combines two tales about the actions of the Gaulish Celts, the hero's portion and the champion's bargain. Two of the Ulster cycle stories, the Feast of Bricriu and the story of Macdatho's pig, revolve around the idea of the hero's portion. In the former, the main action takes place at a feast where Cet Macmagach, the Connacht champion, has gained the right to carve the pig after insulting and taunting the Ulstermen in attendance to demonstrate his skill. This is when Conall Cernach, the Ulster hero, comes in. After the two men argue over who gets to carve, Cet finally admits that Conall is the superior warrior, saying, "If Anluan were in the house, he would contest with you. We're sorry he wasn't at home." "But he is," Conall replied, and threw a severed head from his belt at Cet. After that, Conall focused on carving the pig. After claiming the best joint for himself, he insulted the Connachtmen by giving them the forelegs. The ensuing skirmish left the floor covered in bodies, and the next morning the blood continued to flow over the threshold. The second theme, the champion's bargain, is introduced when Cu Chulainn and his rivals are asked to cut off the giant's head but are forced to let their own heads be cut off. The manipulation of the hero's portion also centers on the Feast of Bricriu. As the narrative progresses, Cu Chulainn extends himself, anticipating the moment, much like the Gaul does when he lies on his shield in the tale that Posidonius relates with some skepticism. Instead of reporting an act he had seen, the source who told Posidonius the story may have told him a folk tale he had heard. The parallels between Irish and Gaulish customs strongly imply a shared origin, whether it be through observed behavior or oral tradition. In the Tyne, chariots are very common. The text describes, in detail, a two-wheeled vehicle with a light wooden frame. Iron tires were probably on the spoked wheels. A competent charioteer drove the warrior to his battleground while two yoked horses pulled the vehicle. During his campaign in Britain, Julius Caesar saw chariots of this kind. The skill of the charioteer and the vehicle's agility, which enabled the British forces to combine the cavalry's mobility with the infantry's endurance, greatly impressed him. Posidonius documented similar chariots in Gaul 2 generations earlier, and a wealth of archaeological evidence in both Britain and Gaul, including chariot fittings, horse equipment, and in some locations, actual chariot burials, firmly supports the classical texts. Surprisingly, though, there is no archaeological proof of chariots in Ireland. By remembering the archaeological proverb, absence of evidence does not necessarily mean absence. We can examine the possibility that the Irish Iron Age society never used the war chariot. What does this leave us with, then? The core of the Ulster Cycle's sagas and stories must have come from an Iron Age setting, making them a source of unmatched value. Is it an Irish milieu, though? Could an old pan-European folk tale depicting a heroic era between the 5th and 2nd centuries have included Irish names and locations? Such a potent tale embodying heroic ideals and swiftly and extensively spreading its word would draw in even the most remote communities that adhered to the Latin belief system. Whatever the cause, it is truly miraculous that this Irish-influenced custom has survived. Every community has a culture, a set of defining principles that define who they are. Although cultures are multifaceted, at their core, they represent the values and beliefs of the social group, and typically include both a sense of the past and hopes for the future. An anthropologist or sociologist approaches culture through direct interaction with the group under study. When studying the more distant past, an archaeologist must mostly rely on surviving material remains, occasionally augmented by skewed anecdotes extracted from bits of modern writing. The definition of a prehistoric culture seemed relatively simple 50 years ago. Works from that era are full of phrases like Michelsburg culture, Beaker culture, and Urnfield culture. However, archaeologists are now more cautious, understanding that while these terms are generally helpful as general archaeological constructs, they may have little reality when trying to understand how past communities defined their identity. Does the term Celtic culture exist? No, must be the answer. For the purposes of this argument, the material culture of the 3 communities believed to have spoken an early form of Celtic language in the 6th century BC, the Lepontic region, Ireland, and the center of the Iberian Peninsula, does not provide much evidence of a shared set of values that would indicate any meaningful level of cultural unity. In fact, these disparate individuals were likely unable to comprehend one another's speech. For convenience, they would have derived their sense of self from their larger social structures, known as tribes, and their lineage groups. Some tribes would not have regarded themselves as belonging to a Celtic nation, even though they may have established confederations and alliances and given them names. As we have seen, things started to change in the 5th century. A package of ideas was dispersed throughout Europe by the rise of Latin culture, centered in the Marne-Moselle region, and the ensuing migrations to the south and east. The ongoing movement of people during the 4th and 2nd centuries, along with activity through pre-existing trade networks, facilitated and accelerated the exchange of ideas. Therefore, the Latin culture is present in much of Middle Europe, from Ireland to the Black Sea. Consequently, some authors posit that they can interchange the depiction of the Celts by classical authors with the archaeology-defined Latin culture. For this reason, we often refer to the most prevalent art form in Latin settings as Celtic art. This shorthand nomenclature, which simplifies generalizing statements, may result in unsupported assumptions. We need to make an effort to dispel some of these assumptions. The idea that Latin culture comprises a fairly cohesive set of values and beliefs is a helpful generalization. Latin culture encompasses a range of funeral customs, such as inhumation and cremation, that involve burying the deceased in a single grave, usually accompanied by various personal belongings, and placing these graves in cemeteries. People often assume that men carry swords, spears, and shields, while women may wear armlets and safety pin brooches. Even though there are a lot of regional variances and exceptions to these generalizations, surprisingly large areas show striking similarities. Burials as distant as Transylvania, the Po Valley, and the Marne clearly share a common tradition and suggest that these disparate communities share similar values and beliefs. Celtic art, or decorative styles, convey a similar narrative. Archaeological evidence shows how the Latin artisans' repertoire rapidly expanded after they developed in the 5th century, serving the elites of the Marne and Moselle regions. The ongoing contact between the communities that had settled in the Po Valley and those still in the Transalpine homeland in the 4th century led to the incorporation of new Etruscan-inspired concepts into the rapidly changing and increasingly unique schools of Latin craft activity. Interpreters were interested in the motifs and their arrangement, which elevated Celtic art beyond mere decorative art. They most likely granted the owner divine protection and conveyed identity and status. For instance, people widely recognize the boar's symbolism. They see it on shields from the River Witham and southern France, helmet crests from Romania to the suburbs of London, and on a Swiss sword blade. It is tempting to view the boar as a talisman, to ward off danger, or to give the bearer more strength. Often, motifs swirl around the human head. The terret rings from a horse harness, discovered in northern France and currently housed in the Musée National des Antiquités in Paris, serve as an excellent example of this phenomenon. The heads appear from the background of flowery scrolls once one learns to look for them. In jest, the renowned art historian Paul Jacobstall called this Cheshire cat style. Sometimes the whole cat is visible in the tree, and other times just its smile. If you stare intently at the shield facing dredged from the Witham River, you will see doe-eyed horse heads with wings instead of ears. Similarly, if you think about the circular shield boss from the Thames at Wandsworth, the swirling tendrils resolve into two terrifying birds. It's a form of dream art where shapes abruptly shift and things don't appear exactly as they should. This type of shape-shifting is common in the literature of the insular vernacular. There's another thing to think about. An object with distinctive motifs has an identity, and an identity allows an object to accumulate a history. Therefore, it is highly probable that people would have recognized, discussed, and even held in high regard a unique helmet, shield, or sword in its ornate scabbard. A weapon that eliminated powerful adversaries in well-known battles could never acquire an air of authority. If it became so powerful, only gods could use it and die. Such a system may explain the many prestige armor items found in bogs and rivers. The distribution of objects in Celtic art must, in part, reflect the region where those belief systems were understood and most likely practiced if Celtic art reflects complex belief systems. However, the truth is more nuanced. Gift-exchanging cycles can pass down Celtic art pieces, isolating them completely from the context of their understood significance. A decorated sword scabbard in central Spain or a bronze bowl in Poland might represent nothing more than transferring a valuable object from one world to another. On the other hand, the growth of regional craft skills can result in the creation of comparable or identical objects that use the same motifs or closely correspond with local interpretations, thereby transferring some elements of the value system. As mentioned, the Marne-Moselle region was the center of early Latin developments, and the first folk movements likely originated there and in Bohemia. According to a study on Celtic burials in the Po Valley, the various tribal groups continued to practice their native burial customs. While the Boii shared many traits with the burial customs found in Bohemia, the Cenomani and Senones brought with them the customs of the Marne region. Enough archaeological evidence suggests that the migrant populations carried many cultural belongings with them. Furthermore, an analysis of early Celtic art indicates that to further stimulate the Transalpine schools, immigrant craftspeople absorbed concepts from Greco-Etruscan culture and transmitted them northward. As we move eastward, we come across cemeteries that embody the traditional Latin characteristics dispersed across Transylvania, Transdanubia, Moravia, and the Tisa Valley. People widely use swords, and a vibrant school of artisans created unique patterns for the sheath decorations. Art historians have called them the Hungarian sword style because of their uniqueness, even though they follow the general Latin development tradition. Other artifacts, particularly those from the core zone and the eastern regions, show broad similarities across large areas. For example, there is a preference for sophisticated, wheel-made jars with elaborate designs in pottery. Although many distinct regional styles exist, the general parallels between Marne and Transylvania, communities dispersed over 1,500 km² expressing a preference for one culture over another, stand out. It would be laborious to list every example, but taken as a whole, the archaeological data clearly points to the Latin cultural package's broad acceptance, adoption, and upkeep throughout Middle Europe. It's difficult to say how much of this resulted from a widespread folk movement. Given the already densely populated Danube Valley, it is likely that the incomers were numerically in the minority, despite the certainty of a migration from the early Latin core region. If this is indeed the case, the arrival of the dominant cultural package is significant. Additionally, the evidence from place names suggests that the spoken language may have been Celtic. Therefore, the people of the Moselle Valley and a village in central Romania may have had quite different genetic compositions, but they shared a similar material culture, and most likely, ingrained values. The same conditions did not apply to the migrants who crossed the Bosphorus and Dardanelles in 278 to settle and raid Asia Minor. Even though they continued to go by the name Galatians, as we have seen, they appear to have quickly renounced all traces of Latin material culture in favor of the local culture. Based on the evidence that has survived, it is challenging to ascertain whether they gave up their conventional belief systems. Western France, Britain, and Ireland, located west of the early Latin core zone, absorbed aspects of the Latin cultural packages in different ways. Later classical writers, for instance, accepted Armorica, modern Brittany, as a part of Celtica, and used the early Latin Celtic art motifs to decorate pottery. The often illustrated urn from Saint-Paul-de-Léon in Finistère serves as a striking illustration of this interaction. Two examples of decorated metalwork that remarkably resemble the elaborate pattern of flowing palmettes and arabesques engraved on its surface are a decorated disc from Auvers-sur-Oise and the Etruscan flagon. intricately engraved by a craftsman from La Tène, and currently housed in the museum at Besançon in eastern France. Undoubtedly, the Armorican potter wanted to incorporate the decorative styles popular in the Marne region and beyond into their work. The transmission medium was probably the ornamented bronze vessels and other high-end metalwork from the central workshops. These goods most likely made their way westward via vast trade networks, perhaps in return for raw materials like tin along the Loire Valley. Some Armorican pots bear a striking resemblance to bronze bowls, prototypes of which we have not yet found in the area. Additionally, we discovered a beautifully decorated helmet southwest of Finistère. These exchanges quickly spread knowledge of the metalworker's decorative art throughout Wales, Ireland, and southwest Britain. Although the technique originated in Britain, Cerrig Drudion in Wales decorated a bronze-hanging bowl or lid in a manner very similar to the Besançon flagon. Small bronze bowls of the same style replicated in Armorica pottery are also well known in the southwest of Britain and Ireland.
Adobe Firefly is the all-in-one creative studio with AI-powered image and video editing for today's creative process. Built for creators of every kind, Firefly helps you generate, edit, and experiment fast. Because the asks aren't getting smaller, the budgets aren't getting bigger, and the timelines, oh yeah, still tight. With all the best creative AI models in one place, Firefly brings your ideas to life. Unlock a better way to make with Adobe Firefly.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Bring a date, your squad, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
In addition to the Atlantic seaways, Britain will have learned about La Tène's art through other channels. A little later, a brilliant school of metalworkers somewhere in eastern Britain was creating extremely unique shields, and the renowned repoussé decorated pony cap found at Tours in Scotland. In the 4th or 3rd century, local artisans produced swords and scabbards in the La Tène style. It was possibly not until the 2nd century BC that Ireland began producing elite metalwork in the style of La Tène. After that, the Irish smiths produced a variety of objects that were all recognizable as La Tène in style, but had unique Irish form and decoration changes. The emerging indigenous culture must be considered when examining the La Tène metalwork of Britain and Ireland. There is no evidence of a significant influx of immigrants, with the possible exception of a minor invasion into eastern Yorkshire in the 5th century. They continued to occupy long-standing locations, allowed local cultures to flourish unhindered, and widely used the native architectural style of circular houses. However, it is clear that Britain and, to a lesser extent, Ireland, remained a part of a sea-connected exchange network with the continent. Through gifts that the elites traded with one another, these systems would have largely brought the characteristics of La Tène culture to the islands. The gifts could have included women with personal and dress ornaments, trained horses and equipment. The factory produced items such as weapons and cooking equipment, even skilled artisans. Many parts of Britain accepted the associated meanings and value systems and embraced these external, visible manifestations of La Tène culture. Given the amazing variety of exquisite metalwork created on these islands, it is indisputable that the communities of Britain and Ireland became an essential part of the La Tène cultural zone, even though they only partially adopted elements of it. In the first paragraph of his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar stated that Gaul as a whole consists of 3 parts. One is inhabited by the Belgae, another by the Aquitani, and the third by the people we call Gauls, though in their own language they are called Celts. This statement offers a helpful generalization regarding the ethnic makeup of Gaul in the middle of the 1st century BC. These 3 peoples are quite distinct in language, customs, and laws. Caesar continues by giving the zones some geographic specificity. The Seine and Marne border it on the north, and the Garonne borders the Celtic tribes' territory on the south. The Atlantic marks the boundary to the west. The Celts stretch to the Rhine to the northeast, and the Rhone marks the border to the south. The political and ethnic shifts that began in the latter decades of the 2nd century can help explain why Caesar's Celts lived in a much more constrained area than the Latin culture of the 3rd and 2nd centuries. The Romans themselves brought about the change in the south. The route from Italy along the north coast of the Mediterranean served as an essential communication line for the armies and traders operating in the Iberian Peninsula during the 2nd century BC. Greek cities such as Massalia ruled the friendly territory it traveled through, but hill tribes to the north constantly threatened it. Due to the severity of these attacks, the Romans dispatched an army in 124 and 123 BC to defeat the Ligurians, the Saluvii, and the Vocontii. In 122 and 121 BC, they defeated the Allobroges and Arverni along the Rhone Valley. The Romans created the province of Transalpine Gaul by reorganizing the recently conquered area and the Greek coastal cities. To control the westward route via the Aude and the Carcassonne Gap to the Garonne and Gironde, the Romans occupied native settlements such as Vienne and Geneva and founded the citizen colony of Narbo Martius near the ancient hill town of Narbo. A few years later, the Romans extended their authority to the Garonne, establishing a Roman garrison at Tolosa, Toulouse. The south had already been Romanized for 60 years by the time Caesar arrived in Gaul, and the province was rapidly encroaching on the lands of the Celtic tribes. Though the specifics could be clearer, significant changes occurred in the north. As a generalization, it would appear that the northern European tribes, often referred to as Germans by the classical writers, were encroaching southward into regions where Latin culture had previously flourished. The arrival of the Marcomanni, a Germanic tribe in Bohemia, the ancestral home of the Celtic Boii, is among the most obvious examples. Germanic tribes had already crossed the Rhine and established new tribal homelands further west. The Romans, constantly afraid of hordes of northern barbarians threatening Italy, were well aware of this massive southward movement in the latter decades of the 2nd century BC. Around 60 BC, a Germanic tribe known as the Suebi, under the leadership of Ariovistus, crossed the Upper Rhine to take advantage of rivalries between two Celtic tribes in northeastern Gaul, the Sequani and the Aedui. The Helvetii, who were now in Switzerland, had decided to move in large numbers to the Atlantic coast, leaving their former homeland vulnerable to Germanic settlers. Caesar used these occurrences as justification to advance his armies into Free Gaul. He asserted that the Germans would do so unless Rome seized control of Gaul. Caesar asserted that the Belgaes lived between the Rhine and the Seine-Marne and were different from the Celts. Being closest to the Germans, with whom they were always at war, and furthest from the energizing luxuries of the Mediterranean, they were the most resilient of the Gaulish inhabitants. However, according to Caesar, the southern portion of the Belgic territory was part of the Latin cultural zone, which is difficult to differentiate from that of the nearby Celts. Tribal movements continuously reshaped the cultural gradient between Germanic and Celtic Latin, forming the area between the Rhine and the Seine. We may view it as a Celtic region that is progressively becoming more Germanized at the most basic level of generalization. Regardless, Caesar, who witnessed the situation firsthand in the middle of the 1st century BC, felt compelled to distinguish the Belgae from the Celts on a linguistic and cultural level. Caesar also came across Gaulish tribes that were undergoing change. The eastern and southern tribes had been in close contact with the Roman world for over 3 generations, and some of them, such as the Aedui, had directly placed themselves under Roman patronage. A more stable government with annually elected magistrates replaced the old warrior aristocracies based on a man's capacity to draw followers. Dramatic social change swept through several tribes. Certain tribes, like the Aedui, had effectively implemented a strict system that severely curtailed the magistrate's authority. This system prohibited them from leaving the tribal territory while they served, prohibited them from running for re-election, and prohibited their family members from running for office. Any man who might aspire to kingship and attempt to return to the previous system faced the death penalty. Orgetorix of the Helvetii, the leader of the tribe's planned migration, was one such unfortunate person. Accused of attempting to seize control, he evaded execution by igniting a fire and rallying his family and dependents into a large, menacing mob. However, the public mistakenly believed that Orgetorix had committed suicide when the magistrates mobilized an army to enforce the law. The incident makes clear the true instability of the new system of governance. Roman business people established profitable trading networks with the tribes outside the frontier because of the extended period of direct contact with the Roman world. Cicero makes this very clear. He wrote, "All Gaul is full, and it is full of Roman citizens. Northern Italy was a major exporter of wine to Gaul." Diodorus Siculus quoted Poseidon to describe the Gauls' love of wine. Diodorus Siculus notes that the Gauls have a tendency to get drunk, adding, "Because of this, many Italian merchants, who are typically greedy, view the Celtic love of wine as a treasure. They receive an exceptionally excellent price for one amphora of wine, and they transport it by cart across the open country, and by boat on the navigable rivers. In return for a drink, they are given a slave." Italian traders likely established themselves in all major tribal centers. When the Celtic zone's indigenous tribes rebelled against the Roman presence in Gaul in 52 BC, this was undoubtedly the case at Cenabum, the Carnutes' main town. Caesar states at the beginning, "They killed all the Roman citizens who had settled there as traders and plundered their property." One was an equestrian Roman in charge of the Roman army's grain supply. Caesar believed that the Romanization of Celtic Gaul, resulting from 60 years of interaction with greedy and enterprising traders, had already essentially subdued the region. After dealing with the immediate issues caused by the Helvetes migration and the German war leader Ariovistus's expansionist plans during the campaign's first year, he focused on subduing the Belgae in 57 BC. After defeating a Belgic army at Bibax in the Remise territory, he swiftly advanced northward against the Nervii and the Aduatuci, two more distant Belgic tribes. He personally oversaw the Belgic engagement. In the meantime, he gave his general Crassus the responsibility of accepting the surrender of the Celtic tribes of the Atlantic coast, which he called Armorica, between the mouth of the Seine and the Loire estuary. Then, along the Loire, the legions set up their winter quarters. Next season, the army probably organized a grand campaign, crossing the Rhine and sailing across the Channel to demand homage from the British kings, actions that, if successful, would have astounded the Roman populace with their audacity. However, Veneti's rebellion led the Armorican tribes to alter the plans. Caesar joined his army when it was time for the spring campaign and gave the soldiers in the Loire winter quarters instructions on how to construct boats. Caesar moved against the tribe by land, sending Brutus and the ships to attack the Veneti, who were known to be excellent sailors. The huge sea battle that finally broke out in Quiberon Bay resulted in a Roman victory and the Venetic surrender, but the land campaign proved inconclusive. I decided to punish them with particular severity so that in the future Gauls would have a greater respect for the rights of envoys. I put all their elders to death and sold the rest into slavery, Caesar says crisply as he wraps up his account of events. Meanwhile, Elsewhere in Armorica, in what is now Lower Normandy, Caesar's general Sabinus appears to have won an effortless victory, or so Caesar's description suggests. Caesar had time to launch a late summer campaign against the Belgica coastal tribes, which set the stage for his postponed spectacular now that the Armorican rebellion was over. He first crossed the Rhine to briefly enter German territory the following year, in 55 BC, and then, most likely later than he had planned, he crossed the Channel to launch a risky raid on the Kentish tribes. He was back on the Channel coast the next year, getting ready for another invasion of Britain. He was more successful this time, subduing the strong dynasties of Hertfordshire and Essex. But when he returned to Gaul in the fall, he found Belgica dire. Encouraged by a charismatic war leader, numerous tribes had taken up arms against the Romans and began to apply pressure. The ensuing chaos of marching and countermarching surrounded and destroyed a sizable Roman force and its two commanders, but Caesar's prompt action prevented a catastrophe. He decided to finally address the Belgae issue the following year, in 53 BC. In a purposeful policy of scorched earth, he massacred or sold many native people into slavery during the brutal campaign, destroying the countryside with sword and fire. When we had laid waste to the country in this way, I withdrew the army. The Senones and the Carnutes, two Celtic tribes that occupied the land between the Seine and the Loire, displayed an odd act of defiance against Caesar early in the year. The Senones, the Carnutes, and the Belgic tribe, the Treveri, had been silent during his 5 years of campaigning in Gaul. But they didn't show up when Caesar called a meeting of the Council of the Gauls in the spring of 53. He saw it as the first step toward a war of rebellion. A display of military might swiftly subdued the Romans, but the threat persisted, prompting Caesar to hold an investigation after the campaigning season. The conspiracy's instigator faced execution, while many others fled. The spark ignited a rebellion that spread throughout Celtic Gaul. Druids from all over Gaul congregated in the Carnutes' domain every year. This may not have been a coincidence, but we will never know what drove the Carnutes and Senones to rebel against Caesar. Because the Druids were the only real unifying force in society and possessed significant societal power, the Roman authorities detested and feared them. Who summoned the Gauls to fight Caesar may never be known, but the theory is tenable. In 52 BC, Caesar and his army returned to Gaul, only to find the entire country's center in armed rebellion. The backbone comprised the 3 strong Celtic tribes, the Bituriges, the Arverni, and the Carnutes, that formed a huge arc from the Seine to the Garonne. However, other tribes quickly joined, including the Aedui, who had historically been fierce supporters of Rome. Regretfully, Vercingetorix brought the rebels together under his command. This put Caesar's entire Gallic enterprise in jeopardy, making the situation dire. In the end, Caesar's army ended the uprising in a protracted and violent operation that culminated in the renowned siege of Alesia, thanks to outstanding leadership, military might, and occasionally, pure luck. Vercingetorix had permitted the Roman army to enclose him and numerous rebels in this hilltop settlement. The action culminated in a fierce battle between the Romans and a sizable relieving force from Gaul. Caesar claimed that the force, representing almost all Celtic and Belgic Gaul tribes, had about 8,000 cavalry and 240,000 infantry. Again, Roman discipline won out. Vercingetorix and the others in Alesia eventually surrendered due to the destruction of the relieving force. Caesar claimed to have conquered the whole of Gaul, but dealing with the remaining pockets of resistance took another campaign season. 46 BC, Vercingetorix. The Gaulish tribes rebelled against Rome toward the end of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and in 52 BC, Vercingetorix, a member of the Armenian nobility, took over as war leader. Caesar claimed that Celtillus, the son of Vercingetorix, was once the most powerful man in all of Gaul, but his desire to become king led to his assassination by his fellow tribe members. Vercingetorix seemed to emulate his father's desire for kingship by putting himself forward as a war leader. Initially, his family confined him and banished him from Gergovia. Unfazed, he organized a group of rebels and swiftly gained the support of his tribe, the Arverni. Then came other tribes. His strategy of enlisting the Romans in combat resulted in significant battles during the campaigning season at the Oppida of Noviodunum, Avaricum, and Gergovia. In a costly battle at Gergovia, Caesar narrowly defeated Vercingetorix, who came close to defeating the Romans. The Romans eventually routed Vercingetorix and his army in a field battle, which compelled them to flee to the Elysian hill and swiftly encircle them. The Romans routed the enormous Gaulish relieving force that Vercingetorix had hoped would arrive within sight of Alesia. When there was no more hope, Alesia's defenders gave up. They apprehended Vercingetorix, transported him to Rome, and imprisoned him for 6 years prior to his strangling during Caesar's triumph in 46 BC. For 8 years, Caesar and his armies had been actively waging war in Gaul, killing tens of thousands of people annually and enslaving tens of hundreds more. Several campaigns in the northern Belgic territories set entire landscapes on fire. They killed 1 million Gauls and sold another 1 million into slavery, according to a modern estimate. Experts estimate the population to be between 6 and 7 million, a staggering number. Trauma engulfed Celtic Gaul, causing the Celtic tribes the most suffering. Every community would have felt the wounds. Resentment and accusations must have festered for many generations. It is commonly known and frequently reiterated that no classical author whose writings have survived ever called the people of Britain or Ireland Celts. Even though it's possible that this observation does not disprove the island's Celtic identity, the classical writers saw the people living there as very different from those of Celtica in Gaul. The entire question is neatly dismissed by Tacitus, who wrote in the late 1st century AD. I guess we could stop here and move on, but there are some lines of evidence that are worth looking into further. Who the first inhabitants of Britain were, whether natives or immigrants, remains obscure. One must remember we are dealing with barbarians, he wrote. Several fascinating insights are provided by Julius Caesar, who had some first-hand knowledge of the southeast region of Britain. The most civilized of the Britons are those who live in Kent, which is entirely a maritime area. Their way of life is very like that of the Gauls, he wrote, adding that the population was extremely large, and there were many farms closely resembling those of the Gauls. In his writings on the Druids, he offers an interesting aside. Even today, those who wish to study the doctrine in greater detail typically travel to Britain for their education. Caesar believed that although the Britons and the Gauls were different peoples, their beliefs, values, and lifestyles were very similar. Tacitus's assertion that the Britons descended from the Gauls who migrated to the island supports the idea that, in both countries, you will find the same ritual, the same religious beliefs. He then reverts to the old Celtic stereotypes. There is the same cowardice in shirking danger, the same hardihood in challenging it. There is no substantial difference in language. But the Britons are more spirited. Long peace has yet to weaken them. By contrasting the coastal areas, where immigrant groups from Belgica had settled, with the interior of Britain, where the people claimed to be indigenous, Caesar more overtly implied that people from Gaul had migrated to Britain. These regions still had the names of their original tribes, he said. Individuals from northern Gaul may have migrated to the Solent region and its hinterland in the early decades of the 1st century BC, based on evidence from archaeology and tribal names. It is more challenging to determine what the classical world believed about Britain and Ireland before Caesar's arrival in Kent, but some themes present in earlier works are worth pointing out. In the 4th century AD, the North African Roman Avienus wrote the pretentious poem Ora Maritima, drawing on his knowledge of other earlier works to produce a fantastical portrayal of the coasts from Massalia to the British Isles. He used a 4th century BC source that, perhaps as early as the 6th century BC, details the trip north from Armorica. The Holy Island, as the ancients called it, is 2 days away for a ship to reach. The island is situated between the waves and is quite large. It is widely inhabited by the Hierni race. There is once more an island of the Albiones nearby. Despite its confusing and challenging interpretation, the anonymous source largely concurs that at this early time, Britain was known as Albion and Ireland as Hierio. We can accept both words as names of the native inhabitants because they seem to be early Celtic forms. This information comes from the book On the Ocean, written by the Greek explorer Pytheas after his amazing exploration of the Atlantic coasts of Europe in around 320 BC. Later authors, such as Julius Caesar and the elder Pliny, cited Pytheas's meticulous observations of the land and its inhabitants in On the Ocean as one of his many accomplishments. Pytheas also circumnavigated the British Isles. According to Pliny's description of Britannia Island, Albion was its own name when all were called the Britannias. He then enumerates every other island, such as the Orkneys, Anglesey, Isle of Wight, and the Isle of Man. The inhabitants presumably called the largest island Britannia, known in classical times, Albion. It is generally acknowledged that the Greek geographer Diodorus Siculus was greatly influenced by Pytheas when he wrote one of the first extant texts to use Britannia. Diodorus called her Prytania, but she was originally Pretanic. This implies that the inhabitants were known as Prytani or Pretani. Whereas the Welsh called Britain Prydain, the Romans called the people in northern Britain beyond the frontier the Picts. Interesting questions are raised because the word is typically understood to mean the painted ones or the tattooed folk. It sounds more like a generalized term that people have adopted to describe foreigners than it does like an ethnonym, which is a name that people use to identify themselves. If this is the case, Pytheas might have picked it up from the Celts of Armorica, who told him about their neighbors who painted with woad across the channel. The inhabitants of Albion then took the name Prytani. The Gaulish Celts changed the P to a B by the 1st century BC, and classical writers started using this moniker to refer to the island as Britannia. There is plenty of archaeological evidence to show that Britain and Ireland were intertwined in the intricate web of interactions that held the Atlantic communities together throughout prehistory. The volume of traffic would have varied over time, as would the preferred routes and ports of call. In general, though, we can state that the communities that faced Britain, from Finisterre to the mouth of the Rhine, were probably in fairly frequent contact with those on Britain's neighboring coasts. One such voyage, from an unnamed Armenian port to the British port of Ichthys, somewhere along the south coast of Devon or Cornwall, where the Britons brought tin for exchange, was joined by Pytheas as early as the end of the 4th century. Convincing archaeological evidence later, in the early 1st century BC, points to an active trade axis between Hengistbury Head, which overlooks Christchurch Harbour, and the north coast of Armorica, possibly the Bay of Saint-Brieuc. Every year, a small group of Armorican traders occupied the headland during the trading season. The ties between Armorica and Britain remained strong by Caesar's time. In his writing about the Veneti, he remarks that they frequently sail to and from Britain and have a sizable fleet and exceptional sailing abilities. Long-standing connections exist between the communities of southeastern Britain and the Gaulish Belgae further up the channel. As early as the middle of the 2nd century BC, Gallo-Belgic coinage appeared in Britain. These valuable gold coins would have been exchanged as gifts between the two regions' elites, creating ties of duty and friendship. Intriguingly, Caesar mentions Divitiacus, king of the Suessiones, a Belgic king who, within living memory, ruled over both Britain and a sizable portion of Belgic Gaul. This implies that Divitiacus was acknowledged as a high king by other Gaulish and British rulers. It is easy to imagine exchanging gold gifts for loyalty and possibly services in such a social setting. This lengthy cross-channel contact was briefly broken up by Caesar's swift incursions into the southeast of Britain, but contact soon resumed, and the pace accelerated after Gaul was placed under Roman rule and peace was established. In the major native centers of the southeast, Roman traders most likely now established themselves. These processes inevitably culminated in the conquest of Britain, which was started by Emperor Claudius in AD 43. The Claudian conquest was largely dictated by the condition of the tribes encountered. There were two sizable confederations in the southeast, centered on the Atrebates to the south and the Catuvalauni north of the Thames. Of all, these were the most fully Romanized. Beyond that, from the coast of Dorset to the Humber estuary, lay an arc of less developed tribes, the Durotriges, the Dobuni, and the Corieltauvi. These tribes had nucleated centers where trade and authority were conducted and produced their own currency. Tribes with more dispersed settlement patterns and simpler socioeconomic systems lived beyond them in the country's north and west. All of these elements would have been known to the Romans, and they would have taken them into consideration when they planned their first invasion strategy. They wanted to seize the civilized center of the empire, while the military frontier pushed through the outlying tribes, holding them firmly in place and facing the undeveloped areas outside, where they could find metals, enslaved people, and other valuable resources. Rome recognized two native rulers, Togedubnus in the Solent region and Prasutagus in East Anglia, as client kings for their lifetimes in order to ease the transition of power to the Roman state within the civilized core. In the end, the grand strategy had to be abandoned. The armies soon penetrated deep into Scotland and moved northward and westward into Wales. By the early years of the 2nd century, the frontier had established itself along the Tyne-Solway line, and it progressively moved forward to the Clyde Forth front over the course of the following century. Despite being connected to the Roman province through trade, auxiliary service, and raid, a significant portion of what would eventually become Scotland and all of Ireland lay completely outside the frontier. The portrayal of Britain in Caesar and Tacitus's writings is very similar to what the Celts would have learned from earlier historical narratives. Caesar was especially impressed by the British chariots. In one battle, his enemy Cassivellaunus commanded 4,000 chariots, which he ruthlessly employed against the Romans. The author's enthusiasm is nearly evident in Caesar's vivid account of the warriors' tactics. They start by driving in all directions while brandishing spears. Their opponents are usually scared into confusion by the sound of their wheels and galloping horses. After passing through their own cavalry squadrons, they leap from their chariots and engage in foot combat. In the meantime, the chariot drivers move away from the battle a little, arranging the chariots so that their masters can quickly withdraw to their own lines if the enemy's numbers pressure them. I came to their rescue just in time, for our men were unnerved by these tactics, which were strange to them, Caesar says after praising the charioteers' skill and agility. Caesar's statement and his detailed description of the chariot in action suggest that he had yet to witness this kind of warfare in Gaul, even though it was well known to the Celts a century or more earlier. Thus, the antiquated system of warfare continued to exist in Britain. Boudica, d. 61 AD. At the time of the Roman invasion of Britain in AD 43, Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, a tribe that occupied a large portion of East Anglia. To integrate these kingdoms into the new province, the occupying Roman force permitted Prasutagus and King Togedubnus of the Regni in central southern Britain to keep their kingdoms as clients for their lives. Prasutagus tried to get around this by giving his kingdom to the emperor and his own daughters in a joint will. This was deemed unacceptable by the authorities, who allegedly raped their daughters and beat his wife, Boudica, during a confrontation. Boudica took on the role of war leader due to this uprising. When Santonius Paulinus, the governor, was on a campaign trail in northwest Wales, she picked her moment wisely. Many of Britain's southeast joined the uprising, but apparently not Togodumnus. The rebels burned buildings and massacred residents in Camulodunum, Colchester, Verulamium, St. Albans, and London. During this assault, Boudica was accused of crimes against her adversaries. The Roman army eventually engaged the rebel forces in combat. Boudica continued to fight traditionally, with women on the baggage trains observing from behind and charioteers in the lead. Following the Romans' decisive victory, Boudica poisoned herself to death. Chariots reappear in the final battle of Mons Gropius, where General Agricola crushed the Caledonian Confederacy's resistance in the far north of Scotland in AD 83, and during Boudica's uprising against the Romans in AD 60. Tacitus vividly portrays the vanquished Britons' unbridled rage in the aftermath of that battle, alternating between displays of extraordinary bravery and desperate despair. Tacitus uses the ancient Celtic stereotype once more for dramatic literary effect. Over 350 years passed during the Roman occupation of Britain, although Romanization was sporadic and mostly limited to the country's southeast. Towns and villas were only allowed in this area. Cornwall, a large portion of Wales, most of the north above York and Ireland, lay beyond this area. The Celtic language, oral sagas, ancient laws, and traditional ways of life persisted in these areas. Examining the different lines of evidence to see if a uniquely Celtic entity can be formed from them, or if the whole beloved idea is a mirage, is a convenient way to reflect. In summary, there are four main types of pertinent evidence: language, vernacular traditions, archaeological evidence, and classical sources. Each has its own set of guidelines that govern scholarly discussion and varies in quantity and quality. According to classical sources examining the last half-millennium BC, Celts were found throughout barbarian Europe, except in areas where Scythians were present. Due mainly to the language's survival in the far west, research on the Celtic language group focuses on Western Europe and has a clear Atlantic bias. The vernacular literature is also restricted to the West-West, Ireland, and, to a lesser degree, Wales. On the other hand, the archaeological evidence covers every region where human society has resided and operated. Although the prehistoric era is mainly anonymous, it can offer insightful information on several levels through observable recurring patterns, the most important of which are society's beliefs and value systems and the degree to which they interacted through exchange mechanisms. Every piece of evidence adds to the discussion, but we must steer clear of cliched arguments that produce a list of tenable possibilities, like, because philologists tell us this, the archaeological evidence can be interpreted thus. Since archaeologists interpret their evidence thus, our linguistic suppositions must be correct. Recognizing our biases is also crucial. During the era of widespread colonization in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the study of the classical world dominated the educational system, it was common to consider invasion and colonization the only causes of change, more commonly referred to as progress. Natives don't invent things, Lord Raglan could state without fear of contradiction. The pendulum has swung to the other extreme in the post-colonial and post-classical eras, and archaeologists have tended to minimize or even completely deny the existence of invasions, citing the lack of archaeological evidence as justification. This viewpoint is too radical. it would have been impossible to identify the Celtic raid on Delphi, or, for that matter, the Celts' settlement in Asia Minor, if one had only looked at archaeological evidence. We must rigorously control our preconceptions and prejudices to the greatest extent possible. Having said that, we can start by dispelling two cozy old myths. The first was the coming of the Celts, as the question, "When did the Celts first arrive in Britain?" expresses. Every piece of evidence points to a major oversimplification of this viewpoint. A recognized brotherhood of the Celts that extended from one end of Europe to the other was known as Pan-Celtic Europe. Popular writers and politicians came up with this idea. What can be said, then? The evidence, which was so succinctly outlined in the earlier chapters, enables us to provide a summary of a broad scenario. Given the scarcity of information from the pre-Roman era, the evolution of the Celtic language is arguably the most challenging issue to address. Despite this, most philologists agree that early Celtic versions were widely used throughout Western Europe, from Iberia to Ireland to the Italian lakes in the 6th century BC. It is still entirely up to speculation as to where a unique Celtic language originated. Some observers are happy to place it in the Neolithic era of the 5th millennium BC. This is by no means implausible, and in fact, the exchange of ideas and beliefs that accompanied the establishment of settled agriculture would offer the right setting for developing a language that would enable communication between various communities. Following that, Western European communities shared many aspects of their constantly evolving culture, as the archaeological evidence clearly shows. The vast Atlantic-flowing rivers that stretched from the Rhine to the Guadalquivir deep into continental Europe and the Atlantic seaways served as important communication routes. Over the following 4,000 years, networks of interactions would have developed, providing the perfect environment for language development and convergence. By the late Bronze Age, c. 1300–800 BC, the entire region was tightly connected by exchange networks that shared technological and religious knowledge. The earliest known form of Celtic developed in this atmosphere. A unique warrior-based society emerged during the late Bronze Age across much of Western Europe, including Britain, Ireland, and Iberia. They had a lot in common, even though there were notable regional differences. Both the feasts' accoutrements, like cauldrons and roasting spits, and the warriors' weapons, including swords, spears, shields, and occasionally body armor, are abundant in the archaeological record. During this time, hill fort construction also began. The period's archaeology is replete with evidence of a warrior aristocracy that valued hospitality as a key strategy for preserving social cohesiveness and cultivating relationships with others. It had nothing in common with the type of society that Homer portrayed. The same principles and ideals hold true in the 7th and 8th centuries. Two areas of innovation and intensification, however, can be identified: northeastern Iberia, which is home to a unique Celtic culture, and West-Central Europe, where the warrior aristocracy uses the horse and vehicle as a central part of the funerary ritual, referred to as Hallstatt See in archaeological terminology. Appears. Both innovative centers are located on the edge of the Atlantic zone, and they may be best explained by the regions between the Atlantic and Mediterranean systems, where precocious development is likely to occur. This is an immediate prelude to the Greeks' glimpse of the barbarian world. Their behavior was conditioned by the diverse cultures they encountered, which shared a common language and values. As a result, it was reasonable for the Mediterranean observers to consider them to be a single people and to call them Celts, which was the name used by one of the groups they came across. Given that southern Gaul, in the hinterland of their colony Massalia, was the Greeks' closest point of contact with the northern barbarians in the 6th century, it is possible that the ethnonym was created here. 500 years later, Caesar tells us that this area was inhabited by tribes who called themselves Celts. The idea of Celts as peripheral barbarians first appeared in history in this area. A new dynamic that relied on interaction between the Mediterranean world and the barbarian periphery emerged in the late 6th century. The raw material flow from the resource-rich Atlantic zone to the consuming Mediterranean was accelerated by these exchanges, which attracted the Hallstatt chiefdoms and, to a lesser extent, the Celtiberian chiefdoms. This created a new elite zone in west-central Europe known as the early La Tène chiefdoms, which thrived in the 5th and 4th centuries and revitalized the warrior society's ethos. This may have been the setting for the emergence of an oral tradition that told stories of raids, chariot battles, valiant single combat, and feasting. In a much adapted and localized form, this tradition miraculously survived as the Ulster cycle in Irish vernacular literature. The saga stories and other elements of the belief system were shared by vast areas. For example, Latin art was quickly embraced and modified by Armorica and Britain by the 4th century, and then by Ireland a century or two later. However, assuming that the core zone is the only source of La Tène's cultural package would be incorrect. Ideas would have flowed in all directions along the networks of interaction. Caesar's intriguing claim that Druidism originated in Britain serves as a reminder of this, despite its veracity not being established. The native languages of these areas developed the P-Celtic structure during this time of intense interaction, which covered a large portion of west-central Europe and Britain. Ireland kept its more primitive language form, despite being outside the original sphere of these influences, most likely from the 6th to the 2nd century. As the Phoenicians and Greeks gained more control over the Mediterranean coastal region, the Celtic-speaking communities of the Iberian Peninsula also saw a change in development, becoming more directly oriented to Mediterranean culture rather than sharing the development of Western Central Europe. From the center of the early La Tène zone, and probably from some of the communities of Eastern Gaul, the land of the people who called themselves Celts, the migrants migrated into the Po Valley, along the upper Danube, into the middle Danube Valley, and beyond. Most prevalent perceptions of Celtic society are based on these migrations, viewed through the distorted prism of Mediterranean scrutiny. However, migrants are likely to present a selective and altered version of their culture by their very nature. The dynamic shifted once more as the Celtic-speaking peoples faced mounting pressure from culturally diverse groups along their border in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. From the Mediterranean, Roman influence swept through Iberia and Gaul. The Germans arrived from the north, and Dacian armies advanced into the Middle Danube region from the east, destroying the Celtic communities that had settled there. One of these alien cultures, Rome, eventually spread throughout Europe to the Irish Sea and the Scottish Highlands by the end of the 1st century AD. Along the Rhine-Danube axis, it met the Germans and the Dacians. In addition to introducing a new set of cultural values, such as the Latin language, 4 centuries of Roman rule also caused the gene pool to become mixed due to population mobility within the empire, especially in the cities and frontier areas. Newly recruited auxiliaries marched out to fight wars or patrol far-off frontiers as administrators and traders settled and retired foreign troops arrived. As a result, the indigenous population's genetic makeup has become increasingly diverse, diluting their Celtic identity. But in the 3rd or 4th century, people with Celtic names, sometimes writing in Celtic, still threw curse tablets into Bath's holy spring, and the Celtic language was still spoken in the countryside near Bordeaux, except in the isolated regions of the west, Armorica, Cornwall, Wales, northern Britain, and Ireland, where the Celtic language and some of the cultural characteristics we refer to as Celtic managed to survive. it is easy to assume that the rural populations maintained their native language in some form until the massive Germanic migrations of the late 4th and 5th centuries swept away the last remnants of the old order. This overview of West European prehistory highlights the pervasiveness of culture throughout, but it also highlights how difficult it is to distill it all down to straightforward, even simplistic issues of ethnic identity. We may force contemporary ideas of ethnicity on a period and location where they are meaningless. A Gaul living in the 3rd century BC would have known little more than his tribe, ancestry, and perhaps their allies. If a definition is necessary, we could either take a more inclusive stance and recognize as Celts those who spoke the Atlantic European language we call Celtic, or we could take a more minimalist approach and define the ancient Celts as the tribes that lived between the Seine-Marne and the Garonne, as Caesar claimed. If we feel the need for a definition, it might be better to embrace the more comprehensive perspective, because language is a cultural identifier and contains embedded shared values and beliefs. Barbarians from beyond the borders flooded the Roman provinces, upsetting and, in some cases, completely destroying the empire's infrastructure, plunging Europe into chaos in the 5th century. Visigoths occupied the southwest of Gaul, while Franks and Burgundians from present-day northwest Germany settled in the north. On their way to Iberia and North Africa, contingents of Alans, Vandals, and Suevi swept the nation, further complicating matters. Even more terrifying was the Hun horde that crept into northeastern Gaul before those who had already made their claim drove them out. Boatloads of various groups, commonly known as Anglo-Saxons, arrived in the southeast of Britain from the Low Countries and Jutland coasts. They swiftly spread through Wessex and into the Midlands. After exploring the Gaulish side of the Channel, some of the same groups settled in what is now Lower Normandy. It is difficult to determine the precise numbers involved, and previous overestimations might have added to the overall effect of removing the Romanization overlay and substituting a very different culture in the newly settled areas. The final remnants of Celticness vanished in these tearing upheavals. This does not mean the native population will be eliminated or uprooted, but rather that the remaining members will quickly assimilate into the foreign culture. The indigenous Celtic-speaking cultures in Armorica, southwestern Britain, Wales, northern Britain, and Ireland were mainly unaffected outside the Germanic settlement areas. These regions were not unaffected, though, as it appears that even isolated communities that faced the Atlantic were enmeshed in the craze for folk wandering that now engulfed Europe. Raiders were active in the Irish Sea as early as the middle of the 4th century, probably attracted by the possibility of looting in the coastal areas of Roman Britain. The northern portion of the province was actively pillaged by the Scotti, Atticotti, and Picts from beyond the northern frontier during the 360s. At this time, the Atticotti were either from Ireland or the Western Isles, but the Scotti lived in the northeast of Ireland. Although we don't know much about these events, we do know that some of the raiders, Scotti and Atticotti, later appeared on lists of Roman soldiers stationed on the continent. This is comparable to how Celts had joined Greek tyrants as mercenaries 750 years prior. St. Patrick, a prisoner of a raid in the early 5th century, describes the capture or death of thousands of Britons during this time, though the scope of the Irish raids on Britain is still unknown. One source claims that his mother was British, having been a victim of an earlier raid, while another recounts Niall of the 9 hostages, one of the Irish kings, leading 7 raids on the British coast. There were raids, but there were also settlements. The migration of the tribe from Co is described in the Irish saga The Expulsion of the Daisy, Ireland's Meath. While others continued across the Irish Sea to find land in Dyfed in southwest Wales, others made their homes in Munster and Leinster. After settling in, the migrants remained close to their relatives living in Ireland. The extent of the settlement, which occupied a large portion of southwest Wales, is shown by the distribution of stones engraved in Ogham script. Around this period, another group of Irish settlers settled in northwest Wales on the Lane Peninsula. They were most likely Scoti, though their origin is not immediately clear. According to a Welsh tradition, Irish settlers were driven out of the region by a force of Votandini from north of the ancient Roman frontier. In the 5th century A.D., St. Patrick. The dates of St. Patrick's are uncertain. According to the Irish annals, he arrived in Ireland in A.D. 432, but his death dates range from 461 to 493. It's more likely that one of these dates, likely the later one, is off. But one scholar shrewdly explained this disparity by speculating that there may have been two Patricks. In the Confessio, a document he wrote in his later years, Patrick narrates the main points of his story. He had grown up in a civilized part of Roman Britain. However, he was captured during an Irish raid and later sold into slavery in a remote area of Ireland, where he cared for flocks and herds for 6 years. He discovered a ship exporting hunting dogs headed for Gaul after hearing an angelic voice one day tell him his ship was ready and urging him to walk the 320 kilometers to the coast. After 3 days, they arrived in the country, only to discover it was destroyed by barbarian raids. Eventually, Patrick could return to Britain to be with his family. However, heavenly voices urged him to return to Ireland and serve as a missionary this time. Despite well-established Christian communities in the nation, Patrick chose to conduct his mission in isolated and pagan areas, and it is clear that he was very successful in gaining converts and building a Christian infrastructure. His system was modeled after the Roman one, in which civitates, or administrative zones, were governed by bishops. Monasticism swiftly took place, though, as this system did not mesh well with Ireland's dominant social structure. In the 5th century, a group known as the Scoti lived in northeastern Ireland. According to the life of St. Columba, sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century, a group of 150 people from Dalriata in Antrim set sail across the narrow North Channel to settle in Argyll, establishing the Kingdom of Dalriada, a strong political entity that would eventually control lands on both sides of the Channel. Large-scale Irish settlements in Scotland are suggested by the distribution of Irish place names, which run through Argyll and Bute and down the Galloway Peninsula. The Isle of Man and most of western Scotland and the islands were probably settled during this time. Linguists have long acknowledged that the Irish form of Celtic, which greatly influenced Scottish Gaelic and Manx, was brought about by these 5th century movements. Although this might have been the case, the sea connected these areas. Archaeological evidence unequivocally demonstrates widespread cultural exchange and contact dating back to the Neolithic era. Given these conditions, it would have been reasonable to assume that the regional languages would have become highly similar long before the middle of the 1st millennium A.D. A British monk named Gildas wrote a book titled De Skidioio around 540 A.D., lamenting the plight of the British people as they fled the Anglo-Saxon settlers who had seized most of southeast Britain and were moving west. In a particularly striking section, Gildas tells how the desperate Britons fled to places beyond the seas in their boats, while singing the psalm, "You have given us like sheep for eating, and scattered us among the heathens." We presume they were sailing toward the Armorican Peninsula from the south coasts of Devon and Cornwall. As early as 480, people in Armorica called themselves Britanni, and by the middle of the 6th century, they called the peninsula Britannia, which naturally gave rise to Brittany. Procopius, a Byzantine historian, recognized that British communities were still moving into Brittany and abandoning their native land due to overcrowding. The question of when and why people started to migrate away from Britain has been hotly debated. According to one theory, Irish attacks on the British coast may have been the direct cause of the outward movements beginning as early as the late 3rd century. These attacks persisted sporadically throughout the 4th century, and the first Irish settlers arrived in Cornwall in the 5th century. Although there is no concrete proof of an Irish presence in Cornwall before the 6th century, archaeology strongly suggests that Irish raiders used the Severn estuary as a penetration route. As a precursor to a larger folk movement in the 5th and 6th centuries, there is no reason why small groups of Britons should not have set sail for Armorica during the turbulent 4th century. The Brittonic place names Plew, Tray, and Lan. Concentrate in the north and west of the peninsula, where the immigrants appear to have settled. Presumably based on the names of the British tribal territories from which the settlers originated, these areas were dubbed Domnonais and Cornouailles.
Looking for a protein shake that tastes as good as it performs? Meet Rockin' Protein Max. Packed with 50 grams of fuel, it'll help you keep up when your day won't slow down. And because it's always creamy and never chalky, every sip tastes great. Even better, it's lactose-free and has 0 added sugar. It's not every day you find a protein shake you actually want to finish. Catch Rockin' Protein in the dairy cooler at a store near you. Rockin' Protein and Shamrock Farms are registered trademarks of Shamrock Foods Company.
Welcome to a new era of baseball's great spectacle, the T-Mobile Home Run Derby, live on Netflix. The biggest sluggers in baseball put their talents to the test on All-Star Weekend. Raw power meets star power. Big swagger meets bigger slams. And you don't swing to make contact. You swing to make history. Watch the T-Mobile Home Run Derby live on Netflix this Monday, July 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
The effect of this migration on the evolution of the Breton language has been discussed. It's enough to say that the long-held belief that Breton evolved from the immigrants' language has been replaced by the realization that Celtic survived in Armorica during the Roman interlude and was revitalized by the settlers, whose language was already fairly similar. There will have been enough to demonstrate that the Celtic-speaking peoples of the Atlantic zone, outside the area where the Germanic immigrants settled, were in a state of significant flux during the 5th and 6th centuries. There was a lot of movement between them along the established sea routes. This caused a significant population displacement over 2 centuries. It was as if the gene pool had been thoroughly stirred. The result was a unique Atlantic community, closer to each other because the Celtic speakers realized their language and traditions distinguished them from the foreign Anglo-Saxons and Franks who had gathered along their eastern borders. Even though they were still in use, the Atlantic seaways during the Roman Empire appeared less significant to traders than the easier cross-channel routes to northern Gaul. However, the decline of Roman centralizing power in the West revitalized the Atlantic routes. The discovery of fine red-slipped tableware from Asia Minor and North Africa, as well as Mediterranean pottery, such as amphorae that once held oil and possibly wine, from Asia Minor, Egypt, and North Africa, scattered along the Atlantic coasts of Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, serves as a particularly good example of this. This pottery, which shows an active trading network in the 5th and 6th centuries, is organized in a way we can only speculate about. The cargoes were probably transported by Mediterranean ships to Iberia's Atlantic ports, where they were then transferred to local ships for the trip north. The cargoes probably went through several transshipments, with the last part of the trip to Britain being handled by Gaulish traders. Although the Atlantic trade routes continued to function throughout the 7th century, with cargoes now including distinctive gray pottery from western Gaul, the Loire Valley, or further south in the Gironde region, the supply of Mediterranean products seems to have dried up after the middle of the 6th century. Some were jugs, suggesting barrels of Bordeaux wine, but most were jars, probably holding relish. Similar to the earlier Mediterranean pots, the Celtic-speaking areas of the Atlantic, especially the area surrounding the Irish Sea and its approaches, were the primary distribution points for these 7th century West Gaulish wares. The archaeological distribution maps are further colored by several historical texts. In the life of Saint Columba, who lived on Iona in the second half of the 6th century, Gaulish sailors are described as arriving from the Gaulish provinces in a barca, which is likely a non-local kind of ship. One might be tempted to think that they would enhance the monks' lives by bringing them a year's worth of wine and other exotic treats. About a century later, we learn about a Gaulish bishop who ended up at Iona after being shipwrecked in western Britain. British shipmasters would have made similar trips in reverse, with foreign ships entering western Britain, trading with the locals and bringing back local goods. In the 7th century, we hear of Irish traders coming to the monastery on the island of Noirmoutier, just south of the Loire estuary, to exchange their goods of clothing and shoes, while the Irish ship that carried St. Patrick in the early 5th century was dealing in hunting dogs, most likely bred in Ireland. These scant remnants, extracted from the few extant manuscripts and the dispersal of abandoned potsherds, are invaluable in demonstrating the importance of the Atlantic sea lanes during the 3 centuries following the fall of Roman rule. While the rest of Europe developed independently, the Celtic-speaking coastal communities were bound together by these connections that ran through the coastal waters. These Atlantic communities were characterized not only by the movement of individuals, traders, migrants, and raiders, but also by a growing devotion to a unique ideology, monastic Christianity, and the emergence of several closely related artistic forms that supported it. The center of innovation was Ireland. Christianity was established here in the latter part of the 4th century. In 431, the Gaulish church dispatched a deacon named Palladius to the Christian Irish. His influence was restricted to a small portion of the county, Wicklow, but his influence was greatly overshadowed by Patrick's actions, who the following year built a base at Armagh and began organizing and ministering there. He chose the parochial, a rural area with a church at its center, as his model, and put bishops in charge of the entire system. The patrician church was doomed because monasticism, a novel concept, was gaining traction. It quickly swept across Gaul from the desert fathers of Egypt to Brittany. From then on, the new ideas were swallowed up by the currents of the Celtic-speaking world. Founded on the island of Dare Innis in the Blackwater River's estuary, one of Ireland's first monastic institutions had strong ties to both Brittany and a more distant Mediterranean culture. The system established by Patrick had virtually vanished by the end of the 6th century, as monasticism rapidly expanded throughout Ireland. This phenomenon can be partially explained by the social structure common in the West-West, which emphasized close-knit families and kinship groups. Early Christians had to perform penance and self-mortification to be saved, and the easiest way to do this was to leave the comforts of home and go to isolated, desolate locations. In this context, holy men, also called the Celtic Church's saints, took part in peregrine or sea voyages to found monastic institutions in far-off places. Some, like Columba, established the community on the island of Iona after traveling across the North Channel to Dalriada. Others went a lot farther. Samson was raised in a monastery on Caldy Island, off Wales's south-southwest. He then embarked on a journey that led him via Cornwall to the Brittany coast's north coast, where he eventually established a community at Dal. From there, he traveled extensively throughout Gaul. Religious communities had taken root in the Faroes by around AD 700, and Irish monks had arrived in Iceland within a century. Others journeyed across Europe, establishing monastic institutions wherever the chance arose in France, Germany, and Italy. The insular faith was incredibly vibrant. The religious art that went along with it was equally vibrant, as evidenced by the sculptured high crosses, illuminated manuscripts, reliquaries, chalices, and numerous smaller objects. To create something completely unique, all for the glory of the Christian God, Motifs from the Latene heritage are evident in the designs, but they have been combined with ideas from Spain, France, and Germany. Like Latin art, its direct forerunner in the West, Irish insular art, and the British schools it influenced are considered among the great artistic achievements of barbarian Europe. There is enough evidence to conclude that between the 5th and 8th centuries A.D., the Celtic-speaking populations of the Atlantic regions developed into a fairly cohesive cultural entity. Their shared heritage in language, religion, and art set them apart from the surrounding polities' cultures. The cultural unity stands out, even though there was a great deal of internal variation from region to region, and conflicts frequently broke out, turning communities against one another. This unity was largely reliant on the mobility of the fortunate people to have the sea as their primary means of communication. Surprisingly, little of the original culture was diluted by the Norsemen's subsequent invasions of various parts of the Celtic-speaking regions in the 8th to 10th centuries, followed by Norman, English, and French incursions. While the rest of Europe tried its hardest to split itself apart in horrific wars, the indigenous culture remained low-key.